We're living our truth now. Krista, what?
Krista who?
Christadelphian?
Did you say Christian Dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast. Hello, heathens, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Zinnia. If you've listened to this podcast before, you know that I was raised in the Christadelphian faith, but I left as an adult and became an ex-Christadelphian. After leaving, I discovered that I enjoy history. So in these history episodes of the podcast, I dive into my historical research to explore Christadelphian history from an ex-Christadelphian perspective. Also, just a quick heads up that this episode will likely be very uncomfortable for any Christadelphians listening. As always, you can choose to listen, but please be aware this episode is geared towards people who are not Christadelphians and who are open to hearing information that is not specifically geared towards supporting the Christadelphian ideology. And who knows, maybe no one will get upset about this episode. I did find an interesting quote by a Christadelphian named Charles Bloor. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. In his 1982 book, Dr. Thomas, His Family and the Background of His Times, which got me thinking about how Christadelphians have viewed Christadelphian history. It starts, quote, "Investigation of the past is investigation of something which is unchangeable. The past is truth and unalterable. The only problem is to find it. The cynic asks, what if you discover something horrible in your family? I find the answer to this question, however it may be posed, to be that the facts are the facts. History is solid ground. So I asked myself if I had anything to fear in what I might discover in Dr. Thomas's origin and antecedents. The same is the same. The facts are the facts," unquote. So there's some encouragement from a Christadelphian to be open to the facts. It's all about unchangeable truth, and I can agree with that so far. However, the rest of that quote is as follows. Quote, "The facts are the facts. And if he emerged from an unsavory origin, so much the more wonder might we see in the divine providence in raising such a man as he was to be the instrument of the 19th century rediscovery of the truth, as opposed to all the error that was around him. I reasons, might I rather come to understand more fully the methods and purpose of the divine preparation by which God's instrument was to stand forth without fear or hesitation when once he perceived the elements of the first century faith," unquote. Yeah, so the facts may be the facts, but there can certainly be some variety in how facts are interpreted or valued and presented to others, because our beliefs can certainly bias us, as we see from that quote, and it can show that the research may be done with certain assumptions already in place. And that's why I imagine some people won't like hearing the facts that I uncovered, and why I'm pretty transparent with my views and hopefully offer a refreshingly different viewpoint on Christadelphian history, because I do not believe in his divine preparation of being God's instrument. This example is just one, highlighting the bias that has shaped how their history is told. And as we'll discuss later in this episode, there's more than a little bias if you already believe that John Thomas was an instrument of God or acting under divine providence. Bloor also wrote, quote, "I think Dr. Thomas's pen was being guided," unquote, which for anyone who hasn't heard that expression of a pen being guided refers to the belief that God was directly influencing what Thomas was writing. These myths that John Thomas was acting under divine inspiration to bring us this, they'll get mad at me for saying this, new religion into the world are quite common among Christadelphians. But I believe myths can be debunked with evidence. So our goal today is to look at the facts, to see what the facts are, without the belief that John Thomas is God's instrument. Instead, I'm probably his toughest critic when it comes to Christadelphian history, and I will tell you if something doesn't hold up. So for anyone who is just curious to learn about historical facts you probably never knew, and who isn't emotionally attached to this idea that John Thomas was divinely inspired, I think you're really going to like this episode. Today we'll be exploring the history of the medical qualifications of Dr. John Thomas, the founder of the Christadelphian faith, This episode will also build on information I've already provided about John Thomas in episode 2 and episode 6, so you may want to listen to those first if you're new to the podcast. All right, so first, this topic wasn't even initially on my radar because when I first read the various Christadelphian history books, before I even had the idea to start this podcast, nothing really jumped out at me during a cursory read that made me wonder if anything was amiss with his doctor status. His medical career was also just regularly alluded to without much comment, and Peter Hemingway even had a chapter on his qualifications in his book, John Thomas, His Friends and His Faith. And it assures his readers that everything's all good. But as I'm often finding in my research, most of the historical writings of the Christadelphians have something hiding beneath the surface or are written in a way to disguise certain facts that weren't flattering about their founder. And while his medical qualifications may seem like they might not be particularly interesting or even relevant to the religion itself, one thing to consider is that Dr. Thomas was the only member that I'm aware of who was almost always referred to as doctor rather than brother by those in the same faith as him. And it's so normalized that those of us who are raised in the group don't even stop to wonder, why was this guy a doctor? Why was he defined by this profession when his claim to fame in the community was creating the religion? Like, this is actually a really specific and unique attribute for him throughout his life. And I don't know of many other religions founded by doctors. I did a quick Google search and no examples popped up for a religion founded by a doctor. Yeah, including the Christadelphians. Yeah, even Google was like, Christa who? So in this episode, we're also going to look deeper to try to learn about who John Thomas was in this context of medicine, what potentially motivated his interest in medicine, and uncover some stories that Christadelphians don't even seem to know about in relation to this topic. I also discovered at least one resource that I don't think any Christadelphian historians know about, so I'm excited to share that with you. As always, I'll also compare what I found with what's recorded in the official histories by Christadelphians, mostly Peter Hemingway, and we'll see what they probably got right, what they got wrong, and what was hidden, erased, or just forgotten over time. So the idea to investigate this topic started when I was researching episode 6, the true crime episode, and I noticed the first just possible inconsistency in the story of John Thomas as a doctor. I had looked into John Thomas's writings to the Lancet when he was living in England and when he was writing in support of increasing the legal access to bodies for medical students. And we were speculating on the possibility that he had possibly been digging up bodies for anatomy lessons, which was unfortunately common for medical students in that time period. And when I was reading these articles, I noticed that he didn't sign off as a doctor or an MD at the end of the articles like he always did in America. And it seems pretty intuitive that if you're writing about matters concerning doctors, you would want to include your relevant title indicating your qualifications for that topic. But if he had been a doctor, he was strangely quiet about it, which was quite unlike him. I mean, he had everyone call him doctor instead of brother, even in the churches or ecclesias he attended. So I wouldn't think that he omitted that because he was just humble about it. It's also not just ex-Christadelphians who notice this. Late Christadelphian S.M. Alger says in his writings, Dr. John Thomas, quote, "In passing we note the doctor is called Esquire and neither doctor or Mr. as for a surgeon," unquote. But I wanted to get more information to understand why that was, even if there was nothing amiss and he simply was working towards his degree at that time. So I brought it up in the ex-Christadelphian Facebook group, and that's when Dr. Craig Fairweather and I started talking. As it turns out, Craig had also noticed this, as well as others, and suspected that the doctor had not been entirely truthful with his qualifications. So he offered to share his thoughts and any materials that could help me with this topic for the podcast. So today I'll be revealing all the research that I found on this topic. But before we begin, I just wanted to say that this episode wouldn't have been possible without the help of Dr. Craig Fairweather from Sydney, Australia, who encouraged me to pursue this. So thank you very much for sharing resources, chatting with me over email about this from literally across the world, and helping me with this episode idea. I appreciate the collaboration. And today we'll finally get the answer to the question of whether the doctor was even a doctor. So without further ado, let's get into it and start some myth busting. I should probably start by mentioning that we very briefly touched on John Thomas's medical studies in episode 2 when I mentioned his credentials as they're recorded in Peter Hemingway's book, and I'll go over the basic information that he records on this topic as a refresher. The only things I really remarked on in episode 2 was that I thought it was odd that someone could practice medicine after just 2 years of study. In Hemingway's book, John Thomas was recorded as starting medical studies and taking classes at St. Thomas's Hospital in England from 1826 through 1828. Hemingway's book includes a picture of the document indicating that Thomas took the required lectures and attended 2 anatomy dissections at St. Thomas's Hospital. This is also repeated in another Christadelphian book, The Life of Dr. Thomas, which also includes a picture of this document from the program, which is said to be in the possession of some Christadelphians in Connecticut. Hemingway also mentions in his book that prior to attending the formal courses, John Thomas had been apprenticing with a surgeon for about 3 years prior to starting those studies at St. Thomas's Hospital. This combination of essentially shadowing a medical professional through an apprenticeship and attending courses was pretty standard for that time. After his graduation, Hemingway recorded that apparently Thomas ran his own medical practice for several years. Hemingway wrote, quote, "At the age of 25, he became officially entitled to practice medicine within the realm of England and its dependencies when he enrolled as a member of the British College of Surgeons in June 1830, unquote. The Royal College of Surgeons England was the highest regulating body for surgeons at the time and would have also lent additional prestige and status to those within the profession who became members. Hemingway also wrote that by the time Thomas was leaving for America, quote, "In May 1832, Dr. Thomas was a fully certified medical practitioner, having qualified as a surgeon, and he left behind his own successful 3-year private practice at Hackney, London," unquote. So, case closed. Episode over. He's a doctor, he had his own medical practice, and everything, right? And, maybe if this was a podcast by Christadelphians for Christadelphians, then that might be as deep as we would go. But not here on this podcast. We are just getting started. In fact, even here, just reading through his book, if you slow down during your reading, you'll start to see the smallest of cracks in the story already, because Hemingway has a teeny tiny footnote in his book that is important. And the first 2 myths we're going to explore will come from Hemingway's book. The third is going to be something that Hemingway doesn't even appear to have on his radar, which is going to be fun. So in this footnote, it brings up the modern version of this organization and mentions that the Royal College of Surgeons of England archives has not been able to verify that John Thomas was ever a member there, despite what should have been 3 years of membership while Thomas was working at his private practice after his graduation. I confirmed this by reaching out to them myself this year as I was working on this episode. They did say that there were 2 other John Thomases, but neither was our guy, and neither of those guys were even listed on the register for that year, 1830. And that's the one that Hemingway has recorded in his book. So already we found one thing that seems a little shady when we look a little closer at the facts as they've been recorded in official Christadelphian histories. So our first myth today is the claim that John Thomas was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons. And let's start by looking at where did this claim come from, and then we'll examine evidence for and against this claim. Apparently, the evidence for this claim that Thomas was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons comes from a mysterious letter, which Hemingway did not reproduce in his book, did not identify the location of, and did not provide any details of who the author was or when it was written. He only says, quote, "A letter exists," unquote, which is pretty vague compared to, how he had named the family and which ecclesia they attend for the Christadelphians who own the other document referenced in that chapter for St. Thomas's Hospital. I'm sure that Bigfoot also exists, but where does he live and where did he come from? Who knows? But I'm sure because there's a letter that exists somewhere that indicates that Bigfoot is real. So rest assured, it must be true. And the fact that this other letter has detailed provenance makes me wonder, why is the provenance of this letter so vague and hidden by comparison? Who wrote it, and why should I believe this claim when it can't be independently verified? It doesn't even sound like Hemingway has seen this letter himself, so it may just be another myth that has kind of whispered down the lane its way into modern Christadelphian history books just by being repeated. I will also add that by now have found that usually when something is hidden by Christadelphians, it's because the facts aren't that flattering to them, which means I'd be extra curious to see if this letter exists and whether or not it's legitimate. Okay, so after recording this entire episode, I actually was able to locate a source that has a transcript of this letter and shares its provenance. So I'm just adding this clip into this episode. So in the Christadelphian magazine, Robert Roberts shares that the letter was found in John Thomas's papers after his death with permission of his daughter Eusebia Thomas. However, it's unclear where the original is now. Robert said that he received copies of these letters, so maybe Eusebia held on to the originals for a bit. Maybe she eventually gave those to the Christadelphian magazine. That would make the most sense to me, but we're not entirely sure. Anyways, in the April 1886 edition of the Christadelphian magazine, it provides a transcript of the letter, which reads, quote, British College of Surgeons, London, June 18th, 1830. Sir, I have the honor to inform you that you have been duly enrolled as a member of the British College of Surgeons under the first class, and after the next general meeting, you will receive a document signed by the council of that institution in conformity with the stipulation in the 4th resolution of bylaws herewith sent, and I am, sir, your very obedient servant, Christopher Irving, LLD, FSA, Secretary, to John Thomas, Esquire, Surgeon, etc., Wells Street, Hackney, unquote. Okay, so it's helpful to finally know what the letter said, to know when it was written. So the next question is this solid evidence? Personally, I don't think so, because it points out a glaring issue. Where is the document that was supposedly produced at this next meeting? And don't tell me that John Thomas lost it, because he was able to keep this letter with him from 1830 until his death in 1871 when this was found. And this was despite moving countries. He moved across the United States multiple times. So I would expect that he would have held on to that official document more so than this random letter. So just sharing some additional information I found on the mysterious letter after I recorded this episode. Okay, now back to the original recording. So it appears that the origin of this myth is a dubious letter, but we still don't have any evidence for it. If he was a member at that time, where's the official record of it, either in his own papers or in the organization's archives? So far, no official documents from the organization have been found, but we're going to go deeper than just pointing out the lack of evidence here. If you slow down while reading this chapter in Hemingway's book, you'll actually see your first clue there as to whether this claim is true or not. As Hemingway pointed out, the next logical step after Thomas's graduation would have been to apply for membership with the Royal College of Surgeons, right? And according to Hemingway, quote, Dr. Thomas was more than qualified, as only 2 courses and 5 years of apprenticeship were then required, unquote. Okay, got that? But that's only the first part of the clue. Keeping that in mind, let's look back at the qualifications Hemingway shared earlier in that chapter. Hemingway wrote that John Thomas attended 3 courses at St. Thomas's Hospital, and it sounds like those courses were more similar to what we would call semesters today. So because he took these 3 courses, that would exceed the 2-course requirement Hemingway just mentioned. So far, so good. However, on literally the page before the claim that John Thomas was, quote, more than qualified, unquote, Hemingway also writes that John Thomas had only remained as an apprentice for 3 years, leaving John Thomas 2 years short of the 5-year apprenticeship requirement for membership. See what I mean about finding a clue in his book? Because the math ain't mathin' over here. So while Thomas may have been overqualified based on his course attendance at the time of his graduation, he never completed the mandatory 5 years of apprenticeship. It was 5 years, not 3, that were required. So my theory is, John Thomas was likely not a member of the Royal College of Surgeons at all due to his incomplete apprenticeship. Since there's no evidence that John Thomas had completed 5 years of apprenticeship by the time he graduated, and there's no proof of membership, this leads me to speculate that John Thomas may have been ineligible or outright rejected from membership with the Royal College of Surgeons England at that time. And despite us coming to opposite conclusions, that theory so far is based on the official Christadelphian resource here, So this is another instance of how Christadelphian history is often written as if everything is correct and makes sense, but then things just kind of start to fall apart when someone tries to evaluate their statements more objectively. In this example, Hemingway claims John Thomas was more than qualified, despite not presenting enough evidence to substantiate the claim that he even met the minimum qualifications. But I also found more evidence for my theory outside of the Christadelphian writings. So earlier this year, I found a resource that I don't believe the Peter Hemingway has seen before. And honestly, it's the closest I've come in life to finding buried treasure. It was pretty thrilling, uncovering kind of a secret gold mine as far as history on John Thomas's medical careers goes, so I will be referencing it heavily in this episode. I will also add that my co-explorers for the search were some librarians in Virginia and whoever, as an archivist, digitized this resource from the 1800s. So a big thank you to anyone who helped with that. This new resource is a contemporary biography of John Thomas. And one thing that I noticed was that the biography did not include anything about John Thomas and his supposed membership with the Royal College of Surgeons. And since this biography was meant as a comprehensive history of his career and included his other medical qualifications from England and was presumably written based on what John Thomas had said himself, I believe that the membership claim should have and would have been included in that biography rather than omitted if he had actually been a member. So the absence of evidence is becoming fairly compelling as well. And I found even more evidence to refute the claim that John Thomas was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons. After I discovered the transcript of the letter, I decided to send it over to the archivist at the Royal College of Surgeons, England, to ask them to authenticate it. I figured they could confirm at least whether the person who is said to have written it was truly the secretary at the time who would have been sending it, and just to see if it basically looked and sounded like their official letters from that time period. So let me share their response with you that they sent to me. Quote, "I'm afraid we can't confirm the information in the letter transcript you have enclosed. To mine and my colleagues' knowledge, there was no institution formerly known as the British College of Surgeons. By 1830, we were known as the Royal College of Surgeons of England. I have also not come across the wording first class before. You either did or did not receive your diploma," unquote. Yeah, so I think we have our answer. I believe this letter, which has been used as the sole evidence for this claim for literally generations, is fraudulent. The listed name is incorrect for the organization itself, which is a major red flag. And Hemingway repeats this claim in his book, saying that Thomas was a member of the British College of Surgeons. But it turns out that that didn't even exist. I had initially assumed that that name was probably just an outdated name and they had changed to the Royal College of Surgeons later. But she just confirmed that by 1830, that was their name. That would have been what they wrote if this really was dated June 1830. And so it's just incredible that the archivists have literally never heard of that organization, and I would therefore presume that it most likely never existed. Secondly, the content does not make sense according to these experts at the Royal College of Surgeons, England. There was no first class option. That didn't exist. So either he was talking about some other organization, or he simply made this up and wanted to sound extra prestigious. And this is such an incredible discovery because not only did John Thomas apparently lie about membership in a medical organization in England, but he also kept these allegedly fraudulent papers on him and presumably used them during his lifetime to trick and manipulate people into thinking he had prestigious medical qualifications that he did not have. That is incredibly deceptive. And unfortunately, no one has doubted him enough to challenge the evidence that he provided. And so instead, these lies have continued to be repeated in the Christadelphian literature. And everyone has assumed that he had been a member of the Royal College of Surgeons and that this letter was proof. Fortunately for our ex-Christadelphian community, I am finally challenging the evidence and looking at it myself to see what the truth of the matter is. However, I'm open to changing my mind if additional evidence is available. While working on this episode, I kept finding new pieces of evidence and having to go back and rewrite sections so things can always change when something new is discovered. So if anyone has honestly any verifiable source to prove Thomas's membership there that I haven't seen, please share it with me, because I'm happy to revise this theory if there is enough valid evidence to do so. I'll just splice it in and be like, hey, here's an update. Although, to be fair, in a shocking twist, I'll actually make it easier for Christadelphians to try to refute me if they want, or at least just record their history more accurately. And how? Well, during my research for this episode, I found a fact that actually helps Christadelphians with this issue just a tiny bit. That biography I found claims that John Thomas actually had 4 of the 5 years of apprenticeship, not just 3. Remember how I said I don't think Hemingway knows about this biography I found? One of the reasons why I say that is because this 4th year of apprenticeship isn't included in Hemingway's book. So rather than only completing 3 years, John Thomas likely completed 4, and still 1 year short of qualifying, but it's closer. So let me read what it says about his apprenticeship in this other biography. According to this source, quote, at the age of 17, he was articled to a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons for 5 years. After 3 years, his articles were transferred to a surgeon of the British Navy, then in private practice, and accoucheur. Here his opportunities were extensive in the obstetric department, where the cases afforded were so burdensomely numerous as to create in him a distaste for this branch of the profession, unquote. And for anyone not familiar with the term accoucheur, it just means a male midwife. That was at a time when men were newly starting to work as midwives, but we'll touch back on that more later. So according to this source, John Thomas was supposed to obtain his 5 years of apprenticeship with a surgeon. He was all set up and ready to go. Also, a discrepancy that I'll point out was that John Thomas was not initially with a Navy surgeon, as recorded in Hemingway's account, but instead this records that happened later when he transferred to work with a second surgeon who had been in the Navy. But regardless, this source claims that after only 3 years, Thomas transferred his apprenticeship to work with someone else before leaving his apprenticeship entirely without completing it after 4 years. And what I really like about this source is that it was very specific that he had only 4 years of apprenticeship, and there's no mention of going back to complete it either, which further bolsters my theory as well. This biography was published in 1848, 20 years after his graduation from St. Thomas's Hospital, so I feel that covers more than enough time to document any additional experience he had after that. And yet there is still no proof of him completing his apprenticeship or joining the Royal College of Surgeons. Maybe they accepted work experience in place of a year of apprenticeship, I don't know. But he is not listed, and there are no compelling reasons that would support why that might be. And while it still doesn't give Thomas the 5 years to qualify for the Royal College of Surgeons, it does get him closer to that, and it does clarify the sort of work he was doing, which had been unclear previously. So even though it's not what they might want to hear, I'm actually helping you out by giving you additional information. And now Christadelphians only need to find proof for 1 more year of his apprenticeship to bolster their claim that they have published in writing that he was more than qualified. So we're closer. And while we're on the topic of his apprenticeship, one other thing that I found interesting in this source is that it also explains why John Thomas didn't complete his apprenticeship. Basically, John Thomas hated the day-to-day work of being a doctor, so he dropped out of his apprenticeship and he started attending school to learn theory instead, which he said better suited him. This dislike of physical work and preference for talking, reading, and writing will be pretty consistent through the rest of his life. The biography says, quote, having fagged through 4 years in practical medicine, surgery, pharmacy, and obstetrics, he obtained leave to transfer his attention from the drudgery of physic to its theoretical and scientific investigation. He accordingly entered himself to the lectures of St. Thomas and Guy's hospital schools, unquote. Okay, so not only do we have pretty solid evidence that Thomas dropped out of his apprenticeship without completing it after 4 years, but now we also know why, and it makes sense because it sounds like he hated it. But rather than leaving the profession at that point, which would kind of make sense, he just began the formal classes that are on his certificate, which Hemingway included in his book instead. The dates also match up here with him beginning those classes in 1826, because he was born in 1805, classes started at 17, which would be 1822, and he did 4 years of apprenticeship, bringing us to 1826, which is when the paperwork indicates that he began attending classes at St. Thomas's Hospital. So that all adds up so far. And yes, I'll also repeat that he did start his apprenticeship at 17, although he likely began other medical studies earlier. Hemingway wrote in his book that he hadn't been able to verify what age John Thomas began his studies, so there you go, Peter. The apprenticeship began at 17. And just be sure to mention where you learned about this resource if you include these changes in future editions of your book. It was Zinnia at the Life After Leaving podcast, and now we're collaborators. Okay. So looking at our first myth, that John Thomas was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, until further evidence is produced and is validated, this claim just doesn't hold up. So for now, one myth busted. So let's move on to our next myth. The next claim that comes up in Hemingway's record of John Thomas's medical qualifications is that John Thomas taught himself midwifery. Hemingway records in his book that, quote, Dr. Thomas obtained a letter certifying that he had also attended lectures in midwifery and the diseases of women and children. This letter was among his papers after his death. Several sources, including Robert Roberts, indicate he had actually written the lectures himself, unquote. Okay. Please tell me that I'm not the only one who is already getting tired of hearing about these mysterious letters that are never actually published or quoted directly. Like, I could say that I have a letter saying I won a prize for the best podcast in the whole world. But if I never provide the evidence of that letter and who wrote it, generally people won't believe me. And if this letter exists, who is it by? Where is it now? When was it written? Who knows? But apparently Christadelphians will just keep publishing this claim anyways. And honestly, if we slow down our reading again, this is just a bizarre claim to repeat because it doesn't even make sense. Shouldn't it be that he either attended the lectures or that he wrote the lectures? Which is it? Because the intention of the letter seems to be to document that Thomas was taught about midwifery, right? But then Robert seems to have believed that the letter indicates that he hadn't been taught, but in fact was teaching the class, which is completely different, and it doesn't explain when he actually took a class on midwifery to learn it. Like, did Robert Roberts really believe that John Thomas could just give himself credentials? I mean, to be fair, Thomas basically did that with his religious education, like, oh, I studied the Bible, and now I'm telling you all my opinions are the correct ones, and I'm an expert. But, like, I don't think anyone would be impressed if I said, oh, yeah, I got a university degree, but I also taught all the classes, and I certified that I took them, and I signed my own degree. But, you know, I have a letter saying that I took all these classes that I definitely taught, so it's fine. Well, no. That would be fraud. And someone should have explained that to Robert Roberts. And until this letter is reproduced, it's a bit unclear even what the letter was trying to claim. So this is another thing that Christadelphians tell us just trust them on, as they keep republishing this dubious claim for generations while not investigating if it's true or sharing where their letter is or even who wrote it. Just trust us that this bizarre claim is true, just like our doctrines. But based on what we know about John Thomas, this claim should be pretty surprising because, as a reminder, we just read a quote that John Thomas hated obstetrics because it was so burdensome that it gave him a distaste for the branch of medicine and may have even contributed to him leaving his apprenticeship. So why would he want to teach it? All right, so let's dig into this a little deeper and look at some actual evidence to figure out what's going on here. And while the secondhand comments about this secret letter are vague at best, I do think I was able to find an explanation for what it was trying to say in my buried treasure resource. Again, do you see why I got so excited about this resource? It's a good resource and very useful for this episode. All right, so here's another quote from this biography, which gives some background to how John Thomas got his first job after his graduation from the hospital school. Quote, "It is customary at St. Thomas's to offer prizes in anatomy and surgery. 2 were offered at the conclusion of the session. A day was appointed for the examination of candidates, and the medical public in general invited. The anatomical theater, which is capable of seating several hundreds, was crowded. Dr. Thomas was one of the aspirants, and after an examination of 2 or 3 hours, had the honor of receiving one of them for his proficiency in the sciences, unquote. So John Thomas apparently did really well on some exams at the end of the school year, and because of this success, he was apparently hired for a job. After he was appointed to that job, it says that, quote, "This appointment resulted from the friendly offices of a physician for whom he wrote a course of lectures on obstetrics and the diseases of women and children, which were afterwards delivered in regular courses at a medical school," unquote. So, as shocking as this is for me to admit, there may be some truth to this claim, although it shows that the letter was likely misinterpreted by Robert Roberts, which is not that reassuring when a huge part of this religion is based on what Roberts had to say about what John Thomas wrote. But to be fair, people at the time really used to write in like cursive by hand, and spelling wasn't standardized, so maybe Robert Roberts just struggled to read the letter clearly. And that's fair. I struggled to read any of these 1800 documents that weren't printed in a printing press. It's very tedious trying to read their handwriting. And the source I found does record that John Thomas learned midwifery in the last year of his apprenticeship when he was working with the Navy surgeon, so he did learn obstetrics under a professional. He knew about it. It was the 1800s, but he knew what they knew then. I also learned the name of the second doctor who John Thomas trained under. In the Christadelphian magazine's April 1886 edition, it includes a letter written by this Dr. T.L. Blundell, who attests that John Thomas attended his lectures on midwifery and the diseases of women and children, and that he worked alongside him in his role as physician accoucheur. I sent this name over to the Royal College of Surgeons archivists, and they confirmed that Dr. Thomas Leigh, Leigh, Blundell, is recorded as a member of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1812. Then, during his first job after graduation, we have a record that Thomas wrote lectures on midwifery and the diseases of women and children. So the nuance here is that he didn't actually teach this course himself. Instead, Thomas seems to have contributed to writing a curriculum for someone else to use. So although this claim seems to have some truth to it, this myth that John Thomas taught himself midwifery and or taught midwifery professional is another myth busted. But while we're on the topic of John Thomas teaching, I actually have something new to add to John Thomas's resume again, because I don't believe Hemingway includes this information on his chapter on John Thomas's medical qualifications, and it's somewhat related to this myth we just reviewed. So while I was investigating whether John Thomas had ever taught midwifery before leaving England, I noticed that my new resource did record John Thomas's teaching for a year, but it wasn't midwifery, to be clear. No. It was, quote, "demonstrator of anatomy," unquote, which, well, it sounds like a euphemism for a guy whose kink is public masturbation because he's demonstrating his anatomy. At that time, that would have meant that John Thomas was dissecting corpses for medical students. And, well, it's kind of gross because, like, these weren't even preserved bodies with chemicals. And at that time, they would have most likely been the bodies of criminals or bodies that were dug up illegally from graveyards at that time, as we discussed in the true crime episode. So sometimes the staff at the schools would be the ones to steal the bodies, and other times they would buy them on the black market. Later, the Anatomy Act of 1832 helped medical schools expand legal access to bodies for dissection, but this was the 1820s still, so there were a lot of resurrections happening in graveyards to meet the needs of medical schools at that time, including this time that John Thomas would have been working as a demonstrator of anatomy. So John Thomas would have been teaching students about the body and dissecting in front of them. One article called Medical Training in the United States Prior to the Civil War, written by Robert Slauson, MD, explains more about this new class. Quote, "A demonstrator in anatomy, the individual who actually performed the dissection and explained the process to the class, was included, and so anatomy was the first laboratory course introduced into medical education. These dissections were usually done in as short a time as possible because of the decomposition of the cadaver in those days, with neither preservatives nor adequate refrigeration being available. Most of the operations done were bloodletting, lancing of boils, blistering, and dressing of injuries. An occasional amputation was done," unquote. So that gives us some insight into what he was teaching, and it was honestly pretty gross. The reason I bring this up is because it does show that Thomas gained some teaching experience in England, while also reinforcing that he never taught midwifery or obstetrics. So if we wanted more evidence that John Thomas did not teach midwifery, this would be it, because this source specifies what subject he was teaching, and other sources can confirm what material these anatomy classes covered. This is the only year he was teaching and the only subject that he is recorded as teaching in that time frame between his hospital graduation and before he left for America. And just to go a tiny bit deeper and really nerd out, we can even find more evidence of this by using a timeline based on his writings, namely his articles to the Lancet. In June 1829, they published his article called On the Immateriality of the Mind, which is essentially about how John Thomas believed that humans have souls that survive death. So it's definitely a short but interesting read for Christadelphians, since it's the exact opposite of what he taught later in the Christadelphians. However, the most important thing that I want to mention is how he signs off here. This also brings us full circle already, since this is one of the reasons I started the research for this episode. He signed this article by John Thomas, Esquire, Demonstrator of Anatomy. And so he lists the same position and subject that we then see recorded in his biography that I found. Perfect. I love the consistency of the facts here, and the date makes sense since the document from St. Thomas's Hospital says he graduated May 1828, and that was June 1829. And again, when we look at his Lancet articles to make a timeline, we can verify that it was just this one session, since later that same year, in September 1829, when he wrote his next article for the Lancet, that I'm definitely mispronouncing, called Improvements on Civial's Lithoneuritic Instruments, John Thomas included that he had moved from Dean Street to Hackney, and he no longer mentioned being a demonstrator of anatomy. So John Thomas was probably teaching anatomy from around the summer or fall of 1828 after he graduated through the summer of 1829. And you may not have noticed, but I still haven't mentioned where he was teaching. But fortunately for us, the biography I found said that shortly after graduation, quote, he was appointed Demonstrator of Anatomy to the Southwark branch of the Royal Western Hospital School, which he held for one session, unquote. So now we know what he was doing after his graduation, where he was teaching, how long he was teaching, and what he was teaching. Also, to go back to our first myth for a second, Hemingway claimed that John Thomas applied to the Royal College of Surgeons in June of 1830, which would be a few months after this. So if Thomas ever did do additional time in an apprenticeship, it should have been around this time, although I found no evidence for that. But maybe they allow teaching as a substitution for the apprenticeship, I don't know. Also, as another quick edit from the Christadelphian magazine from the April 1886 edition, one weird thing that I found in that article is that John Thomas got 2 letters from the last doctor he apprenticed with, the one he was with for a year, named Mr. T.L. Blandell. And so he wrote those 2 letters on May 4th, 1832, just 2 weeks before John Thomas left England. The first letter says that John Thomas attended 4 classes on midwifery, which Blandell had taught. Then in the other letter, Blandell writes that John Thomas won that prize at the school that was mentioned, and that John Thomas taught anatomy for a year at the School of Medicine and Surgery in Southwark, London. So what was odd to me is that the Royal Western Hospital name was not mentioned in that official letter that he took with him to America, and clearly had written for him to take to America, given the timeline. So just one more thing that I recently found and thought I would include in this episode, because I am trying to be thorough with everything that I found. All right. But looking at the evidence that I found, it does seem that John Thomas was teaching for a year after graduating, but not midwifery. Again, to be clear. So maybe he was illegally to get bodies for dissection? I don't know. I'll continue to speculate. But either way, he was not teaching midwifery. Like I said earlier, though, I'm finding a lot of new information in this biography, and his role as a teacher at this school has not been included in any of the biographies by Christadelphians about John Thomas as far as I'm aware. So I'm glad that at least by looking into this, I was able to give us a fuller picture of what he was doing in England during that time frame while investigating this myth. So to wrap up the myth that John Thomas taught himself midwifery, I think the most likely explanation for how this myth came about is just that Robert Roberts misunderstood the contents of a letter, because it does seem to be true that John Thomas did write midwifery lectures around that time, but the context that was missing was that the lectures were written for someone else to teach while he taught anatomy. So, this second secret letter myth can officially be laid to rest now, over 150 years after this claim first began to circulate and get repeated. And unfortunately, my findings did bring up one loose end for me to try to resolve. What and where is the Royal Western Hospital School Southwark branch? I was hoping to find some information about this school, so I reached out to the relevant archives in England, but no one in the Southwark archives had heard of this medical school that was apparently located there at some point. And then the archivists at the Royal College of Surgeons of England, which apparently keep tons of hospital records, hadn't even heard of them either. So that wasn't a great start. I did keep searching using advice from these archivists, and it was only while searching through the British newspaper archive that I found a single advertisement in a newspaper from June 1830 for a school called Royal Western College. So the good news is it does seem like this school existed. The bad news is that this school essentially disappeared without a trace shortly after he left. So no one really knows much about it. I would guess that at some point after in 1830, they closed down or merged with another school or something to cause it to completely disappear from public records and awareness. But I literally can't find enough documentation on this school to even verify what time period this school operated or anything like that. All I could seem to find was that it does seem to have existed at that time, which is good enough for us right now. And since we can't find an archive holding information on the school, I certainly don't think these midwifery lessons are ever going to resurface. Although it would be fascinating to know what antiquated methods John Thomas supported at the time in the 1800s. And while we're on the topic of John Thomas and midwifery, this might be a good time to bring up another article he wrote while he was in London. And this one is pretty bonkers. It's called Case of Imperforate Anus. And those are two words I never thought I'd ever say in my life. And just as a heads up, this will not be the only time we're talking about John Thomas and butts in this episode. So get ready for that. This article, written by John Thomas to The Lancet, was written about, quote, one of nature's freaks, unquote. This freak of nature, as categorized by Thomas, was actually a baby girl who apparently had not peed or pooped since she had been born. Instead, she was vomiting frequently and her abdomen was swelling. So John Thomas, in his professional capacity as a surgeon, looked at her little butt and discovered that he couldn't insert his probe up her butt because of an obstruction. And even more oddly, there was no sign of feces on his probe. So he sent the baby home without any treatment, where the baby girl continued to be extremely ill and died at 7 days old. So interestingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, John Thomas felt no sadness at the passing of the baby and instead asked the mother for the body so that he could perform an autopsy, which was how he discovered that, quote, the anus seemed to have no communication with the canal, unquote, and, quote, discovered a perfect cul-de-sac, unquote, inside her rectum. So it sounds like the child had a deformed digestive system that did not allow for elimination because the digested food was not able to pass through the intestines and out the body. And instead, I guess it was staying in her abdomen or coming back out her throat through her vomit. And to be fair, at the time, they didn't have the modern technology that we have today. If this baby was born today, it probably would have undergone x-rays and had a surgery to reconnect the digestive tract. But x-rays weren't even discovered until 1895, decades after this. So they were limited in what they could identify and what they could do to help. So understandably, John Thomas seems to have no ideas at all for the treatment, since the article records that he basically just sent them back home after the examination, and the next update was that the patient died. And I don't share this story because I'm fascinated with a deformed digestive system. No. I brought this up to talk more about John Thomas and midwifery. So now I want to direct you to what his thoughts were about this situation. Early in his article, he wrote that the mother was, quote, attended by a practitioner of Sir Anthony Carlisle's approval, namely, a woman, unquote. And yes, he emphasized a woman in italics in his article, just as he also emphasized the phrase sage femme, another word for female midwife at the time. So it was immediately clear to me that John Thomas hated these women in the medical profession and could only refer to them with like disdain and sarcasm. It's possible that he also just hated all women, but here in particular, he was targeting female midwives. And you might think I'm being dramatic here, but later in the article, after he wrapped up his findings from the autopsy, he got right into summarizing his thesis for this article. Quote, "This case shows, I think, the indispensable necessity there is of the practice of midwifery being confided solely to male practitioners." Unquote. What? Like, how did you reach that conclusion, JT? So let's see what he says. Because not only did John Thomas dehumanize and cruelly call this baby girl one of nature's freaks, but his argument for why he is a better midwife is by boldly insisting that the female midwife who had tried to treat the child for what they clearly suspected was constipation was that the midwife caused the baby to suffer. That was his reason for why women shouldn't be midwives. And how did the midwife cause suffering? By doing treatments that would work on a baby with a functional, normal digestive system. She didn't know the baby had a cul-de-sac instead of a digestive tract. So his argument seems to be that because he was a man, he was more qualified to make the right decision regarding treatment, and he would have chosen to not treat the baby and just let it die. That's the manly way to reduce suffering. Just eliminate medical treatment and let them die. And then blame women. That's what you do too at the end. But seriously, just from the description of the baby and the fact that it died about a week after birth, this baby was clearly suffering because of this birth defect and the discomfort of not being able to properly digest food. Clearly, the midwife didn't cause the suffering, but was instead actively trying to address the suffering that the baby was born with. Looking at this from an outside perspective hundreds of years later, this midwife actually sounds more knowledgeable than him, considering the many methods of treatment she tried that are listed in the beginning of the article. We would also recognize that the baby was born safely, and just to have a safe delivery and a proactive treatment, like I would say the midwife was more than worth the money. She also acted responsibly in suggesting that the mother contact a surgeon. So as far as I'm concerned, his sexist argument was total crap. And honestly, neither of them would have been able to fix this in the 1800s. Like, that baby would have suffered either way. But publishing an article to blame a woman for the death of your patient is absolutely deplorable behavior. This is not a man of superior character. And I probably wouldn't have hammered on this topic so hard if Christadelphians didn't parrot this claim that John Thomas was not only a skilled midwife, and he supposedly taught others about midwifery, posturing himself as an expert in this area. Like, I can't imagine how awful those lessons he wrote were. Step 1, don't treat your patient. Step 2, blame the nearest woman for anything that goes wrong after step 1. Like, to me, rather than proving the point that he was trying to make that men should be midwives rather than women, I think this article instead shows incompetence, arrogance, lack of knowledge, and the dangerous influence of his sexism on his interactions with others. Like, I would much rather have worked with the woman who safely delivered the baby and tried absolutely everything to save it, rather than John Thomas, who just goes, I don't see any poop. I guess just take her home and let her die. And he thought like this article was going to make him look good. Can you imagine how that mom felt? Like, you won't treat my baby and instead you're going to rant about how much you hate my midwife? Great. How much is my copay for that visit? Like, did I hit my deductible by visiting you to tell me how midwives suck while doing absolutely nothing to help? Thanks for that. And sure, tell everyone how you're the best midwife while you take my money while doing absolutely nothing to help my kid. That must have been so infuriating and then insulting on top of that. And did he forget that the baby was also no longer under the midwife's care? It was in fact under his care when he died? Like, why did he even publish this? That's just embarrassing to him. I mean, I suspect that he, just first off, lacked the emotional depth to take any accountability or learn anything from this. So instead, he wanted to shift the blame or just that icky feeling of shame, like, off of himself. Unfortunately, women were the easiest scapegoat he could find, especially during this time period. I didn't know this before, but there was actually a massive change going on around midwifery during this time period, and John Thomas exemplified it perfectly. This also seems to be why he brought up the midwife being approved by Sir Anthony Carlisle. I honestly had no idea what that meant, so I Googled Carlisle's name to try to figure it out, and I discovered an ebook called The Real Mr. Frankenstein, where the author presents his research for why he believes Sir Anthony Carlisle was the inspiration for Dr. Frankenstein, which, yeah, the Frankenstein part is not relevant here that much. It would be fun if it was, but sorry. The book does sound fascinating because the author theorized that someone may have been murdering pregnant women to dissect them, which is absolutely insane. But the book does do a deep dive into the history of the male midwife practices in 1800s London. So that's what's relevant here. And that's what we're going to talk about. So in the book, it clarified that, quote, Carlisle opposed man midwifery, unquote. Okay, so at least that makes sense because men like John Thomas would have been called a male midwife at that time. Sir Anthony Carlisle was instead a strong advocate for women as midwives, and John Thomas basically wanted to take a dig at him in this article because of that stance. And I'm sorry, but before you get your hopes up, Carlisle's stance may not have been as feminist as it sounds, but instead just common sense. It records that having a woman as a midwife resulted in higher survival rates and lower incidences of childbed fever for the mothers compared to when they were attended by men. This is now understood to be related to the lack of hand-washing practices and sanitation at the time, which meant that male midwives and doctors were more likely to spread illnesses to the women and infants. So as it turns out, men were originally ones with the cooties. And even worse, for female midwives at the time, according to this ebook, the Church of England basically got jealous of female midwives because they were also involved in post-birth rituals, such as christening and baptism, which meant that they would receive money as gifts for these services. The church apparently heard the word money and became Mr. Krabs, wanting to take all that money out of the pockets of women. In order to do this, they literally stopped teaching and licensing women midwives and prohibited women baptizing and christening. Since men made the rules, they wrote the rules to benefit themselves. So unfortunately for these women, quote, midwives were without employment protection at the same time as surgeons aggressively sought to earn a living amid increasing competition. Surgeons saw midwifery as a tempting medical field where the incumbent midwives were barred from employment as surgeons. Male surgeons approached pregnancy and births as a career opportunity, unquote. This is probably not surprising, but society was set up to allow men to succeed while hampering women's ability to do so. The article also points out that the women were, quote, more akin to chattel, unquote, than actual humans with rights at the time. Between surgeons like John Thomas seeking their jobs, the church eliminating what little women had in career opportunities, and having this happen when women lacked legal rights meant that women were being aggressively pushed out of the midwifery space at this time. And these changes were done despite the fact that those making these changes knew that it would cost the lives of more women and children in the process. So money was more important than the lives of women and children. And this is what John Thomas was so angry about. He was a vocal proponent for men replacing women in this line of work and did his part by publishing this article with the aim to delegitimize the work of female midwives. So the other result of these changes by the church was that it caused a rise in unlicensed and less trained female midwives, since they were now barred from both education and licensing. Meanwhile, these privileged white men who were able to sign up for the medical training began offering midwife services. The ebook goes into more detail here on like medical instruments and stuff like that, but we don't need to get into that for this episode. I did think that this other line from the ebook was particularly interesting, though, because it highlights the incompetence and sexism of these male surgeons. It says, quote, these untrained women could not cope with difficult deliveries. They turned to surgeons eager to expand into man midwifery, but without proper midwifery training. Deaths occurred from their ignorance, but the surgeons blamed the unlicensed women, thus eroding the professional reputation of the trained midwife for both simple and difficult deliveries, unquote. Wow, that really captures exactly what we just read in the Lancet article. Like, this literally could have been written about John Thomas specifically or that situation. And we don't know whether he had quality education with that Navy surgeon, but Thomas was an ambitious man who insisted that men are better midwives while blaming the women for any death and suffering of his own patients. It's truly a testament to how deeply ingrained sexism was that the Lancet actually published this article and reinforced these views to their readers. Like, yeah, this article is great. It blames women for everything the men did. Let's just, send it to the presses. And I'll just share 2 more quotes from this ebook because while John Thomas published his snarky comments about Carlyle, Carlyle also had a statement about men like Thomas in response. The ebook said, quote, Carlyle was opposed to man midwives, believing many were poorly trained, and many men midwives cavalier in their approach. Carlyle proposed cases of violent death occurring to mother or infant from the use of surgical instruments or surgical hands should be investigated before a jury, unquote. Damn. Like, those are some fighting words. And I mean, unfortunately, it would have been a jury of all white men because, again, women didn't have rights, so they wouldn't have even been on a jury. And trying to prosecute someone like John Thomas for not being competent or causing a death from their medical intervention probably wouldn't have gone anywhere realistically. But it was interesting that at least one man was calling out the behavior of guys like John Thomas, who acted like they knew everything but just blamed women for everything and made life harder for them. The other interesting insight I had while reading the ebook was just this one last quote. It was that, quote, one can note that career prospects for young men as clerics became hampered by clerical incumbents living longer, so they turned instead to medicine, unquote. Like, again, the parallels to John Thomas are just incredible. So the clerics were the clergy or the priests, so it's essentially saying that young men who had planned to work in churches suddenly were turning to medicine instead. And isn't that funny that John Thomas, the son of a religious leader who partially raised him in a school for sons of ministers, suddenly turned to medicine? And as much as Thomas always claimed that it was the other way around and that he found his interest in religion later on in life, don't forget that he was leading the religious services on the boat to America just a few years after this. So he clearly navigated both religious and medical roles in his youth. Also, I grew up hearing how original and unique John Thomas was for discovering this one truth from God. But it's kind of funny that the author of this ebook, who'd probably never even heard of him, almost seems to be writing about his life. Like, in fact, John Thomas is almost a cliche because his beliefs, his choices, and his career path were all following a really well-worn path by others at that time. He certainly wasn't unique at that time, but hey, if God really wanted to create another sexist, patriarchal religion, he did seem to pick a well-qualified candidate for it. It's still wild to me sometimes that, this guy became, we'll say, famous because he was a household name in the religious community I grew up in. But realistically, John Thomas's main qualification in life was just that he could legally perform like surgery, amputations, and dissections, which is so random. His followers were like, I don't need a guy who studied the Bible. My leader dissects corpses fresh from the graveyard and he hates women. Like, he's perfect to lead us into God's kingdom. I'm like, if I had known him at this time, I'm sure I never would have pictured him founding a religion. And somehow that's what happens in his life. So anyways, this ebook overall provided some good research and insight into male surgeons and midwives at that time in London and was helpful at explaining the competition and changing dynamic between men and women in the profession too. Okay, so now we know all about John Thomas as a surgeon and midwife in England, and you know all about imperforate anus. But have you noticed that I haven't described Dr. Thomas as a doctor yet? So far, I've been referring to him as a surgeon or just John Thomas, and that is an important distinction. If Thomas did indeed sign up and graduate from St. Thomas's Hospital, then those classes and courses would have only qualified him to be a surgeon. However, they would not have qualified him to be a doctor in England. At that time, the medical profession in England had 3 main categories. One website broke down these categories pretty succinctly by saying, quote, all three branches of medicine had legally defined rights and duties. Physicians advised and prescribed medications. Apothecaries compounded and dispensed those remedies, and surgeons performed all physical intervention from bloodletting to amputation. This system was a legislative attempt to create a hierarchy of legitimate practice based on supposed levels of skill and knowledge, unquote. So there were differences in what these medical practitioners were able to do depending on which qualification and level of education they had. Also, yes, I did just say surgeons did bloodletting and amputation. This is just another reminder, this was the 1800s. So there were still people in the medical field that thought that like your blood might be bad and we should just drain that pesky fluid to balance you out. And since we don't have antibiotics for your arm, maybe we should just cut it off. And if you don't like modern science, I highly recommend reading medieval science because you will quickly gain an appreciation for modern science now that doctors don't bring out leeches when you're sick. This also explains the answer to my original question as to why Thomas either signed off as John Thomas Esquire or John Thomas Surgeon instead of John Thomas MD when he published articles in the Lancet during this period. It would also make sense for him to be able to teach anatomy at that time, since like that physical body and its treatment was under the purview of surgeons. Legally, he could not claim to be an MD because he did not have the appropriate education in England, but the claim that he was a surgeon has been holding up overall from what's recorded. So what if John Thomas did want to become a doctor in England? What would he have to do? An article on PubMed explains how it would mostly just require additional education. The article says, quote, physicians were distinguished by the possession of a university medical degree, an MD, the possession of a medical doctorate entitled physicians, and no other medical practitioner to be addressed as doctor. 18th century surgeons, who were of course addressed as Mr., seldom had any formal qualification except in the case of the few who were members of the Company of Surgeons. After the founding of the Royal College of Surgeons of London in 1800, however, it was customary for surgeons to take the examination for membership of the Royal College of Surgeons and put MRCS after their name, unquote. So this explains the framework that John Thomas was working under and how the terminology worked at the time. Legally, John Thomas could not call himself a doctor because in England, that title was strictly reserved to the group of people who had spent the time and money to get an MD degree. So if he had tried to sign off as an MD or even just said he was a doctor, that would have been a major problem for him in England at the time. But he could and did sign some articles as surgeon. Since there were strict conditions for people to use these terms, this is further evidence to support the claim that he was a surgeon, while also clarifying that he was not a doctor. We also know that John Thomas was not a doctor yet because he did not get an MD in England. Peter Hemingway confirms this when he writes that, quote, Dr. Thomas obtained nearly all his formal and informal schooling as a doctor in England. His MD, however, was awarded in America, unquote. So everything pretty much matches up right now. The only other thing here that I want to point out is the omission of MRCS in his signatures and his articles as well. You know, if he had been a member of the Royal College of Surgeons like he claimed, he would have been rightfully entitled to sign MRCS after his name. So if that was the case, why didn't he? This would indicate that he had passed his exams and that he had additional qualifications and prestige. And since the Christadelphians have claimed that he was a member of this organization, it's interesting that not only, again, do they not have record of his membership there, not only do they not provide evidence that he met the requirements, but John Thomas also, as far as I have found, has never listed MRCS in any of his writings. So my method of kind of fact-checking against his published articles, once again, is unable to offer any support for that claim, whereas it has for some of the others. This also once again shifts the burden of proof onto the Christadelphians, who keep repeating this claim that he was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, despite presenting no evidence for it. And I'm getting very curious to see any evidence for this claim at this point, because I really can't find anything. The other reason why these strict guidelines for individuals in the medical profession in England is important to know is because it contrasts starkly with the regulation of medical professionals in America at that time, or more to the point, the lack of medical regulations at that time. And that difference opens the doors to a lot of possibilities for a certain kind of person. According to the article, Medical Training in the United States Prior to the Civil War, America was moving backwards in its standards for medical professionals around that time. The author of the article, Dr. Robert Slauson, wrote that, quote, most of these states that required licensing in some form in the early years of the 19th century had repealed this requirement by 1850, unquote. This deregulation of the medical profession resulted in it being, quote, possible to call oneself a doctor with no education at all, because no licensing was done in many states, unquote. So in England, it was only those who had studied at a high level to earn an MD and had completed apprenticeships, those people could be called doctor. Well, in America, literally anyone could be called a doctor, even if they hadn't spent a single day in a medical school. As Hemingway wrote in his book, quote, to practice as a doctor, all that was required was to hang out your shingle and wait for patients, unquote. That was unfortunately true. And some of the stories I've read of grifters at the time were pretty shocking, as people could basically torture and maim people in their treatments and face very little consequences because you can't really break a law when they don't exist. And just like we talked earlier about midwives, once education and licensing became harder to get, the qualifications of those in the field dropped fast. Repealing licensing laws had the same effect by removing the incentive for people to go to school to become doctors, as well as in other fields where education had previously been a barrier. Slauson wrote that, quote, it has frequently been noted that the education level of physicians had gone down in this period, as shown by the decrease in entrance requirements and liberal arts education among them. It should be emphasized that this lower education status applied at all levels. In 1800, 75% of lawyers in practice had attended law school, but by 1860, this number had fallen to 25%, unquote. And again, this wasn't great for people seeking medical treatment because then they had fewer legal protections while also presumably receiving lower quality of care. And I'm going to pause for a second here just to make sure we're all on the same page so far, okay? This may also be a good place to pause if you need a break before we dive into the next topic. At this point, John Thomas was not a doctor. The evidence does show that he took coursework to become a surgeon and that he worked as an anatomy teacher in England, and we will loop back to his time working in England right before leaving for America after he finished teaching. But for now, we've confirmed that Thomas did not get an MD in England and was not even able to be called a doctor there. Okay? We're good? Got it. So we're going to pick up the story 4 years after John Thomas's graduation. This brings us to 1832, when John Thomas makes his legendary voyage to America with all the drama we talked about in episode 2. And in true American fashion, things are going to start getting a little crazy now. Because somehow John Thomas left England as a surgeon, but arrived in America as a doctor with an MD degree. Yeah. Who knew Christadelphians believed in magic after all? Because it sure seems like that qualification magically appeared out of nowhere. And I say this because, according to John Thomas himself, his qualifications now included an MD, which he didn't have when he left England. And we just confirmed that he left England as a surgeon. And I found a lot of truth in the claim so far. Some silly mistakes, sure. But overall, there's been a fairly consistent narrative with some truth to it. At least there was, until he reinvented himself in America, and not in the reading the Bible every day way that we were told when we were Christadelphians either. Suddenly, John Thomas has everything that he didn't have in England. Now he has the title of doctor, which was off limits to him, and the status and impression of intelligence that having an MD degree could lend to him in his medical practice. But obviously, as we know already, this was total bullshit. Because sure, nowadays you can do a degree online, but do you really think that John Thomas completed an entire medical degree while traveling by boat in the 1830s during a freaking cholera outbreak? No, he wasn't taking classes over Zoom about the 4 humors and the best leeches for bloodletting or whatever they taught in medical school at that time. Thomas simply knew that in America, he didn't have to play by those pesky rules anymore. As I said earlier, unlike in England, anyone could be called a doctor. and doctors didn't have to meet any of those bothersome qualifications to work in the medical profession. Americans in the 1800s weren't that concerned about who's giving who drugs and who's amputating whose arm. Why would we regulate that? And while John Thomas certainly didn't create this system, I believe, based on my research, that he immediately saw an opportunity to exploit it and to take advantage of it. So in this next section, we're going to dive into one of the biggest lies John Thomas got away with. Well, at least until now. So let me walk you through all the evidence that I found that John Thomas pretended to have an MD degree after his initial arrival in America. So as I mentioned in episode 2 of this podcast, John Thomas left for America in 1832, and upon arrival in New York, John Thomas shortly thereafter traveled to Ohio and became a baptized Campbellite brother. He said he didn't want to start his medical practice out there, so after that he went down to Virginia, where he met Alexander Campbell, hung out with those Campbellites. He then moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania by 1834, where he settled down with his new wife and became the editor for a new Campbellite magazine he called the Apostolic Advocate. At this point in Philadelphia, John Thomas's writings pick back up again since his writings to the Lancet in England 2 years earlier. And that brings us to the first major piece of evidence I found to present to you. Because in John Thomas's very first edition of his magazine in 1834, he published his name with his credentials right on the cover. And it doesn't say surgeon anymore. If we look at the cover, it says John Thomas, MD. And he continued to publish exclusively as John Thomas, MD after that. But excuse me, JT, where did that MD degree come from? And some of you may have had the same initial thought of me at first where I was like, wait, did I miss some sort of education here? Because Thomas hadn't enrolled in any schools, did he? Or had he even been in one place long enough to take a course anywhere? Did he somehow have a degree? No, he didn't. And why do we know this? Even Christadelphian historian Peter Hemingway records that John Thomas did not have an MD degree until 1848 in America. So he did not possess an MD prior to 1848. But we just read that John Bold-Faced Liar Thomas published this claim that he had an MD as early as 1834, 14 years earlier than 1848. And 14 years of lying is a big deal. Wouldn't you be mad if you found out that someone had lied to you or cheated on you for 14 years? Wouldn't you be mad if your doctor you had been seeing for 14 years didn't have a license or the education they claimed to have while touching and treating you during that time? And wouldn't you be mad if you discovered that you secretly had a twin sister for 16 years and you didn't even know about it until you met her at a summer camp? I think anyone would be. So it does appear that John Thomas almost immediately decided to take advantage of the loose laws of the American medical system. Because the laws of the time did not require a specific level of education to practice as a doctor or require any licensing exams, which would develop later at the state level, any that had existed, as I said before, were actually being repealed around that time. And the results were similar to what we discussed about the changes in midwifery, where once the regulation went away, people were a lot less likely to pursue or complete the previously required education. The incentive essentially went away when people didn't need a license to practice and didn't need to meet certain educational requirements to be seen as valid. This also meant that there were no checks in place to actually say, hey, can you show me your transcripts? And hey, could you prove your knowledge by taking this test? Or hey, can you just provide a copy of your MD degree? No. Now all you need is enough of an ego to convince others of what you want them to believe. So just publish it, cross your fingers, and hope it works out for you. And again, since he had qualifications of a surgeon, it would have actually have been completely fine for people to call him doctor, since in America the term could be used for anyone claiming to be a medical practitioner at the time. It was only in England where they had that strict division between the various types of medical practitioners, and he would have needed the MD to be called doctor. So he could have asked people to call him doctor without making any claims or needing to lie about this degree. That would have been fine. And that's the important distinction here. The problem is claiming to have education and a diploma that he didn't actually have. That is a big problem. Lying about your qualifications is still lying. And when lying to others who are paying you for medical treatment and are then intentionally misinformed, that is deception and could even be dangerous. And I think the choices people make say a lot about their character. And Thomas choosing to lie just because he presumably thinks he can get away with it tells me that he was willing to lie unnecessarily and that he probably lied any other time that he thought he could get away with it too. But it's just really crazy because Thomas probably would have gone to prison if he did this in England. Literally, the only reason this wasn't a huge problem for him during his lifetime was because he was in America, which was still like the Wild West. Like, we'll talk more about why he traveled to America later in this episode too, so keep that in mind. In my mind, what makes this worse is also how bold he was about it, because there is no evidence that John Thomas held an MD before 1848, but he continuously claimed and published in writing that he did during that period. In fact, once I realized this wasn't true, it actually shocked me that he put it on the front page of his magazine every month. And then after lying to his readers for years, he claimed to have the truth. Dude, you can't even tell the truth. So what makes you think that you have the truth? Like, I actually had to debate whether or not to include him in another true crime episode because of this. Like, how many shady activities am I going to uncover on this podcast? Because it's already adding up pretty quickly for this man. What's actually kind of funny is that when he started publishing this magazine, The Apostolic Advocate, people did seem to question his credentials, but not in the way you think. By the third edition of the Apostolic Advocate magazine, he signed the publications as John Thomas, MD, not DD, because he wanted people to know that he was pretending to be a doctor of medicine, not a doctor of divinity. How dare you not realize what subject my fake degree is in? How rude of you. And Hemingway even comments on this. In his book, Hemingway explains that he thought a writer was confusing Campbell's DD degree with Thomas's MD degree, and that's why sometimes there was this confusion, as people must have confused these two men. But Peter, I have to ask, the comment you mentioned was in 1836, 12 years before 1848. So how is it that you're implying that Thomas had an MD to be confused with a DD? This should have been something that got your attention to realize that this claim wasn't true. And this MD, not DD comment actually seems to become something of a catchphrase for Thomas, because even years later in 1850, in the October edition of the New England Botanic Medical and Surgical Journal, a doctor mentioned John Thomas this way, quote, "I spent over a month in London, and while there met with my old friend John Thomas, MD not DD, of Virginia," unquote. And so it seems that people in both the religious and medical community thought he was a doctor of divinity. And he truly did pick a really weird thing to lie about, because everyone just assumed he had a divinity degree that he didn't have. Like, they would have believed him if he said he had a DD, I guess. But instead, he aggressively pushed this lie that he had an MD, even though it was irrelevant to all of this religious work he was getting into around that time. Also, the constant insistence that he had this medical degree and having to say it over and over and over just shows how committed he was to this lie. The real kicker for me too is that he didn't have to lie. And no, I don't mean just that he could have been called a doctor without having this degree, which I already discussed. No, I just mean that it would have been so easy for him to have gotten it. He already had years of coursework done, and he did all that time in that apprenticeship, right? And, while America may not have been as prestigious with their medical schools compared to what they had in the UK, they did have them, and they probably had lower criteria to get into them. And they were located in places that he lived, including Philadelphia. They had them in Ohio. They had medical schools in Virginia. They had medical schools in Illinois. He even worked at the Franklin Medical College in Illinois. So he certainly had enough proximity that he could have enrolled in courses to earn a degree. Even his brother apparently enrolled in college in Illinois, according to Hemingway. So Thomas had plenty of opportunity to actually earn the degree he claimed to have any time during those 14 years. And let's be honest, he could have taken a ship back to England, earned an MD, taken a ship back to America, and still had plenty of time to practice medicine. That's how long he was carrying on this charade. And even with that, he did go back multiple times to England for preaching tours. So it's not like traveling or like getting there was any issue for him. And again, that was just such a long time. So it says a lot about him that he was choosing to live as a fraud for over a decade. And he never actually put in the time and money and anything else that he needed to do just to get the stinking degree. So was he just cheap? Was he lazy? Was he entitled? I don't know. Maybe all three. It wasn't good. There was no good reason for him not to just go get it if that's what he wanted. And while this is one of the earliest and most flagrant places where he claimed to have an MD, I think Hemingway unintentionally provided more evidence for John Thomas starting to lie about having an MD degree even earlier than this. Okay, so on page 228 of Hemingway's second edition is a picture of a certificate from the 1st District Medical Society of Ohio, certifying Dr. John Thomas as a member of the Medical Society in Ohio. This is the earliest known document related to his medical career in America, and it's only a few months after he arrived that same year. And isn't it interesting that he already is saying that he's a doctor? I mean, he sure didn't waste any time taking on that title, even though he also never practiced medicine in Ohio. And sure, he can say he's a doctor now that he's in America. But what I'm seeing here is that in the very first place that he lived after arriving in America, he began rebranding himself as a doctor instead of a surgeon. And it's actually pretty wild to me how fast he made that transition, because adjusting to living in a foreign country takes time. And you might think that he would kind of do the opposite and like resist change at first. You know, like how often do people continue to think the same way that they were raised in their culture? You know, it feels weird to drive on the, quote, wrong side of the road. Or how many months would I live in England before bloody starts to sound like a bad word to me? Or I start saying I'm chuffed about things. I think it would take me maybe a couple months at least, or a little longer, because blood is just a bodily fluid to me. Like, I don't just immediately take on the customs of a new place right away. And so it kind of makes you wonder if that's premeditated. Hemingway also provides documentation of John Thomas claiming that he had an MD in 1833 because he records that John Thomas wrote a pamphlet entitled New Catholic Controversy, or some people would say controversy, and signed it John Thomas, MD. I decided to check this out, and I found another religious magazine which republished part of it. So if we look at the September 1833 edition of the Millennial Harbinger, you'll see it was written by John Thomas, MD. And of course, it includes a quote by Thomas in which he says, quote, "I am actuated solely by a love of the truth," unquote. And honestly, now that I know how much he lies, it really annoys me that he always says he's motivated by truth. Because no, you're not. Like, your actions tell a different story, JT, and I don't trust anything you say. And I know some people think I'm too hard on him, but I actually don't think we're hard enough on him. Like, this guy sucks. So looking at all this evidence, his fraudulent claims appear to have started as early as 1832, shortly after his arrival in America. Hard evidence of the MD claim specifically exists as early as 1833 with this obscure publication of his rantings about Catholics. And regardless, by 1834, Thomas was publishing a magazine with these false credentials on the cover. From this time on, he became the Doctor, and he continues to be referred to as such in the present day. Also, I just want to mention my research into whether John Thomas was also claiming to have an MD while he was living in Illinois. He lived there for a few years after leaving Virginia, but before Richard's Riot, which we discussed in episode 6. So Dr. Craig Fairweather mentioned to me that he hadn't found anything online from the medical college John Thomas had worked at to indicate whether or not the school had advertised him as having an MD. I found the same thing. The advertisements that the school had released that are still archived today showed John Thomas as a faculty member, but they didn't include any credentials for any of their teachers. However, just because we couldn't find the most straightforward evidence doesn't mean that there's no evidence. So, as I was working on this and trying to find something, I guess I had a brain blast because I decided to look at this from a completely different angle and not focus on the school necessarily. Instead, I decided to take a broader focus and also examine John Thomas's writings from the time, because even though he stopped working on the Apostolic Advocate once he left Virginia, he was still publishing while living in Illinois. So while he was there, he started a newspaper with a tediously long, basically 3 titles when you only need one, newspaper called the St. Charles Patriot, Kane County Herald, and Fox River Advocate. I had already found this resource earlier in my research online, like last year, so I remembered it and decided to take another look. And lo and behold, right there on the cover was the now familiar John Thomas, M.D., and this was dated 1842, which is 6 years before the M.D. degree that Hemingway records. So once again, you can follow John Thomas's own writings to document and track that John Thomas was still lying about this. So yes, even without documentation directly from the school saying that and repeating that claim, we can confirm that John Thomas was claiming to have an MD at that time while he was working there. So it doesn't hurt to be enough of a history nerd to have an idea of where to look when you think you've hit a dead end with your research. And yes, I love that the most incriminating evidence I've found for this episode is pretty much directly from John Thomas himself. And just as an aside, I'll be sharing images of these documents on social media, and the links to these documents will be available in the show notes. So feel free to take a look for yourself and check that the dates are literally any year before 1848. And I know that people think history is, it's all just memorizing boring dates. Well, it turns out that it's also just paying attention to dates, and that way you can catch people lying. So there are worthwhile reasons to pay attention to historic dates. And while researching this, I couldn't help but wonder, what percentage of the time was John Thomas lying about being a doctor while working in medicine? Like, was it more than 50% of his time working as a doctor in America? So as it turns out, when we look at the dates to answer that question, it makes this even worse. Hemingway believes the earliest medical practice John Thomas had was in 1834 in Philadelphia, at the same time he started that Apostolic Advocate magazine. Hemingway writes, quote, "Although well qualified as a doctor, however, he in large part, but not entirely, gave up the practice of medicine after 1835, preferring to spend his time mostly in religious pursuits. It is clear, however, he maintained some level of medical practice for years after. He lost medicines in a print shop fire in St. Charles, Illinois in 1841, and physician is among his list of occupations in his famous Confession and Abjuration of 1847, unquote. And that's not good, because Hemingway just provided more evidence that John Thomas was practicing as a doctor in various states in the U.S. between 1834 and 1847. Those are like the exact years that I found these claims of having an MD degree to be fraudulent. So it appears that he was lying about his medical education for essentially the entirety of the time that he was operating a medical practice in the United States. So this is our third busted myth of this episode. John Thomas was not really a doctor when he left England, or for the first perhaps 16 years or so after his arrival to America. He was only qualified as a surgeon, and he lied about having an MD degree for at least 15 years, starting pretty quickly after his arrival to America. And just for a moment, let me bask in uncovering that the founder of this high control group that I was raised in finally got caught lying at a minimum. And by today's standards, he would have been caught committing a felony. He would have had his medical license revoked. And this discovery was made by me, namely a woman. John Thomas, hater of women, unrepentant liar, who tried to take this secret to his grave, got caught by a woman. I mean, it took a few generations to get there, but it still feels good. There have been decades of men studying his life, teaching his beliefs and writing this history while telling women to be quiet and just listen to the facts as the men present them. And then I start talking, and within a year or two, I discover this massive lie. Like, that's pretty cool, but also maybe a reason why we need diversity. And learning this sure changes things, doesn't it? After all, right after he arrived in America is when our pioneer was supposed to be out rediscovering the truth, right? This is when we were given the impression that John Thomas must have been praying earnestly and searching the scriptures and singing hymns to God as he sought out a way to live an honorable life in God's eyes so he would be ready when death came to call after that near shipwreck. And he was doing all these things that, a divine instrument of God does. And some people even believe that God must have saved him on that voyage to America in order to use him as a messenger of divine truth and to save this small group of chosen people. So these facts are very contrary to that myth. Maybe this is the fourth myth that we can lay to rest, is that John Thomas was holy and chosen by God, because I suspect that he was a heathen. The reality is that instead of John Thomas getting closer to God during this period, this is when we see John Thomas start scamming and tricking people during the exact time period in which he was supposed to be reading the Bible to discover the true teachings of first century Christianity. No, it turns out he was lying to everyone because his biggest concern at the time was that he wanted people to think he was a real doctor. Yeah. And this is the exact opposite of what Christadelphians have believed about him during this time. And if you knew someone had a history of bold, and I remind you, unnecessary lies, would you still believe them to tell the truth? Would you in fact call them a pioneer of truth? I mean, JT is such a liar that this is getting me in the mood to watch Catch Me If You Can. Like, this is ridiculous. And it's also just an incredible example of irony. Like, our boy, John Bad Boy Thomas, claims that he almost died on that voyage to America, and that he would die with a prayer to God on his lips. This story goes down in history as the beginning of the creation of a new religion called the Truth. But in fact, he walked off that boat and chose a life of sin and lies. Like, isn't it ironic? Don't you think? It's like you're a doctor, but you have no MD. You're overqualified, but you really dropped out. Your beliefs are truth, but they're built on a lie. And who would have thought it figures? Okay, leaving the 90s for the present day again. That's actually a compelling point, because even though I never even brought up doctrine at all in this episode, and that's really not my focus here, this discovery does a pretty good job at undermining the basis of the Christadelphian religion, because everything is predicated squarely on this man's shoulders, and whether or not what he believed and supposedly rediscovered is the truth. After all, as the Christadelphian writer said, the facts are the facts, and this is our guy who we believe was chosen by the Lord to rediscover the truth. He is an instrument of divine providence. And, people think that he kind of blurs the line between an ordinary person and a modern day prophet. Some Christadelphians really believe that, this guy was chosen by God, and he was uniquely imparted with wisdom. His pen was guided, and God was ensuring that he shared his books with the world. And I guess, there's a belief that the Bible wasn't done yet, so God needed some random guy to write more books, but, it's not a cult. And Bloor's biggest concern from the quote I read at the beginning of this episode was that JT may have emerged from unsavory origin. But I believe that the reality is much worse, because rather than just having a concern about the origins that he has from his youth, it appears that he was an unsavory character at his core as an adult. He was a trickster, a liar, a con man. And it begs the question, how many lies are okay for something called the truth? Can I lie about one thing and still call it the truth? How about 3 things? And if the truth doesn't have to be built on actual truth or facts, then what's the basis for it, and why is anyone calling it the truth at all? It just becomes ridiculously ironic. Like, someone should have fact-checked this before coming up with that phrase to brand it. And I think that if John Thomas had been the founder of another religion, then Christadelphians wouldn't have any problem saying, like, well, he was just a man and clearly his teachings weren't from God. And Christadelphians would believe that with a guy like Joseph Smith. But why? They wouldn't believe it because he wasn't a Christadelphian. I think for Christadelphians learning about this, the issue they run into is their own bias and commitment to defending their long-held beliefs. Usually people learn this doctrine from birth, so I remember how that goes when I was a member myself. And we don't want to believe something that challenges decades of indoctrination and the beliefs that we've built our lives on. It's not fun to acknowledge that you may have been wrong about something. But I think living a life built on truth can sometimes mean letting go of what you once believed was true when the evidence indicates that it's false. That's just growth. It's uncomfortable, but it is part of life. And I do wonder if people will try to defend his choice he made because their cognitive dissonance would kick in, because they're feeling alarmed that the leader of this religion they literally called the truth and have dedicated themselves to follow until death is not truthful. They may argue that because John Thomas was originally a Campbellite after arriving in America, that maybe he's not technically a Christadelphian. Maybe he didn't know better, or he couldn't be held to the same standards, or like he didn't have to be a good person. I don't know. Basically he did that before he was a Christadelphian argument. But as I mentioned in episode 2, Peter Hemingway writes in his book that he believes the origin of the Christadelphians should be considered either July 1843 or possibly 1847, rather than the commonly accepted 1848. So that perspective indicates that explanation wouldn't even make this problem go away, because John Thomas was lying about this until 1848. And other Christadelphians would agree with me that John Thomas's time spent, quote, finding the truth, unquote, overlapped with this period of lying. Late Christadelphian S.M. Alger actually says he was finding the truth for the entire 15 years preceding John Thomas acquiring his MD degree. Alger wrote, quote, since his baptism into a sound understanding of the gospel, either in late February 1847 or very early March, we can see that John Thomas had been 15 years in finding the truth after his arrival in America in 1832, unquote. So the overlap between finding the truth and living a lie was a perfect circle. Alger also says that John Thomas's medical degree was, quote, granted by the president of that college in a letter dated 1st March 1848, the year after his studies of the Bible brought him to a full understanding of the truth, unquote. So this quote is saying that Thomas had a complete and full understanding of Christadelphian beliefs in 1847, the year before getting the degree, which again illustrates my point that John Thomas was intentionally lying about his credentials while also claiming to be a brother in Christ with a full and complete understanding of Christadelphian beliefs and principles. So he was lying about this while he was proclaiming the truth to his followers, founding this religion, and all the while insisting that they call him Dr. Thomas. And those followers at that time believed what Christadelphians still believe today. So he was, unfortunately, by all meaningful accounts, a Christadelphian during at least part of the time, as far as I can tell. And he also never admitted to this or asked for forgiveness. So don't even come at me with the Apostle Paul actually murdered people and now we love his sexist biblical writings. I'm pretty sure that asshole actually apologized and tried to do better. And I still don't think highly of a murderer being in charge of a religious organization, just personally. And also, to be real with you for a second, I've had grown adults literally yelling at me, sending me cards, emails, YouTube videos, or just reminding me at every uncomfortable opportunity that they believe that if I do not become and stay a Christadelphian again until the day I die, that I will not have any hope. I will be cast into darkness. I'll be judged and damned and dead forever, whatnot, while they're out living their best lives with Jesus, singing hymns, murdering heathens. And this religion has been used to try to manipulate me also into being silent after the Manitoulin incident, because speaking up would detract from the good work that this religion supposedly does, as a truth from God. And the reason that I had to endure all that stigma and harassment and drama is because all of those people believed this liar. They genuinely believed that their behavior was justified because John Thomas founded this religion, and I needed to believe it in order to be saved when Christ returns and set up his kingdom and Armageddon happens. But now myself and the people who listen to this podcast know that this guy's a liar who wouldn't know truth if it slapped him across the face. And some people may still not want to believe this, but Zinnia, didn't Hemingway say that John Thomas eventually got an MD degree? Like maybe he eventually made things right and it's really okay because he did the right thing in the end? No, you will be disappointed if you think that. I've got some words to say about the 1848 diploma because it's definitely not that simple or well-intentioned. And what about all the people he was misrepresenting himself to all those years when he was practicing medicine? Like that wouldn't even fix anything. No. And we'll get to all that. That's going to be in the second part of this episode because I am truly plumbing the depths and putting everything out there in this episode. So this will need to be a two-parter for your sanity and mine. Okay. The last thing I'll say about this discovery is that what's almost tragically disappointing about this is that this information was probably the easiest to find out of anything that I've presented to you so far today. Like, it wasn't that hard to find these documents and resources at all. They weren't buried in archives or old books. In fact, both the cover of the first edition of the Apostolic Advocate and John Thomas's medical degree with the date of 1848 are both in Hemingway's book. Hemingway included those two examples from 1832 and 1833 as well that I gave earlier. So what that means is Christadelphians could have discovered this themselves a long time ago. Or they did and just realized it was bad, so they didn't say anything and put those pictures in separate chapters. And I honestly don't know, but this information has been right in front of our faces this whole time. So let me explain a little more. As I said before, Peter Hemingway has an entire chapter of his book devoted to John Thomas's medical qualifications, and he certainly read his earlier writings that said John Thomas MD, while also knowing somewhere that John Thomas did not have an MD yet, since he shares photos of that document showing the date and reiterating that in the book. And yet this inconsistency was not mentioned in his book. And again, I don't know if he was so distracted because he was only looking for the thread of religion through this man's life, or if he saw the problem and just wanted to kind of throw off the trail a little bit. I do think it's possible that it was the second there, but I really can't know for certain. The reason I say this is because on page 226 of the second edition, Hemingway entitles a section Enrolled as a Doctor and refers to Thomas as Dr. Thomas. But that's not accurate. This section described Dr. Thomas graduating from St. Thomas's Hospital as a surgeon and beginning work as a surgeon. Legally, Thomas couldn't have been called a doctor, and he was not enrolled in school as a doctor. So why didn't Hemingway title that section Enrolled as Surgeon? Even in the text, Hemingway seemingly knows this because he wrote specifically that Thomas, quote, qualified as a surgeon, unquote. Nowhere in the text does it describe an MD degree or becoming a doctor. So did Hemingway not know that surgeons were different from doctors in England and was falsely equating them? But regardless, the problem becomes that the page is misleading because in bold text on the page, it implies that this was the schooling Thomas started to be a doctor. And anyone just skimming through this book and reading the section titles would assume that this schooling meant that Thomas was a doctor and that he had the correct credentials, which he did not. And there is another weird and potentially misleading element on page 230, because Hemingway writes about Thomas going to Illinois and teaching at the medical college there that we discussed in episode 6. But for no reason I can understand, in the section about Illinois, Hemingway places an enlargement of Thomas's MD diploma. Why? Why is that picture there? Because, again, Thomas moved to Illinois in 1839, almost a decade before that was done, and he lived there until 1843. Again, before 1848, when he supposedly got this diploma. So he never had that diploma in Illinois. So doesn't it seem a tad misleading to put a picture of something that happened years later into an earlier section? Like if I put a picture of a baby in a section of a biography that was going through that person's childhood, you would naturally assume that the baby in the photo is the subject of the biography, right? But imagine that it's a picture of their child instead as a baby. You'd be a little startled when you actually read the caption and realize it's not following a linear timeline and the photo's irrelevant to that period of their life, right? And pictures tend to get more attention. So by including that, was Hemingway trying to draw attention away from that section, and so that no one would even ask the question of whether he had a degree to be qualified to teach there? And again, maybe it was just bad design choice, but it's very odd that the school that he got this diploma from was covered in the next section on the same page. All you had to do is drop it down and it would have been relevant and made sense. So why wasn't it included in the same section as the school where it was earned? The way it was presented not only doesn't make any sense, but it could be construed as being intentionally misleading to readers. And those readers are primarily going to be Christadelphians, who probably won't be looking at this with a critical eye for facts like I'm trying to do. And we know this because the first sentence of the introduction is, quote, "This book is both a series of glimpses into the origin of the truth in America and a biography of Dr. Thomas," unquote. Hemingway didn't even bother saying it's a glimpse into the origin of Christadelphianism. He's so sure that this faith is the truth that that's how his book starts, and his audience is expected to know that he's referring to the Christadelphian faith. And of course, discovering the lies it was founded on wouldn't be helpful to the intended audience for that book. The problem is, since this is intended for a Christadelphian audience, that sure sounds an awful lot like propaganda to distort the facts to prevent people from learning things that aren't favorable to your organization. This is what I mean when I say the information was right there in the text, but if you just skimmed through or read the headers and just looked at the pictures, it almost tells you an entirely different story based on the word choices and the placement of the images. And I truly hope it's unintentional, but I just don't know. And especially when multiple guests have told me in their interviews that they've met Christadelphians who believe that deception was okay if the lie or misrepresentation that they made people want to stay Christadelphian. And if you're okay with other Christadelphians deceiving people, then does the truth not even matter at all in this religion? And if Hemingway was trying to minimize or distract us from this information, he did a good job. The idea that John Thomas was a doctor with an MD is presented as a given throughout the book. In fact, if you look at the cover of the second edition, he includes John Thomas's signature with the MD designation right on the cover. He never gives you a reason to think twice about that claim. And I'll admit, Hemingway did some great research. He followed a lot of interesting leads. It was very helpful to me with this podcast as a place to start. And he's made corrections for the second edition. So overall, it's a good resource. And I want to say that these major errors or editing decisions may have been accidental. But I think either way, it probably reflects a strong bias at a minimum. And so it's ironic yet again that the evidence that I'm using here for this section is all included in this widely distributed Christadelphian book that's available worldwide. So I kind of can't believe that this is a huge reveal for this episode. Like many Christadelphians have this evidence that John Thomas was lying about his education right in their own homes if they own Hemingway's book. All you have to do is flip through those different sections since they are, coincidentally, not in the same chapter. And I truly hope that no one else knew about this and that I am the first person to connect these dots, because if people did know about this, then that just means it was a larger scale of deception and someone chose to try to hide that problem. But let's wrap up this section with a quote from Hemingway about what we should take away from this. At the end of his medical qualifications chapter, Hemingway writes, quote, "It's obvious his medical experiences led him to think deeply about the false doctrine of the immortal soul, and this became the foundation for most of his independent rediscovery of the truths found in the Bible. Thus, a consideration of his medical background helps us both to understand the man and appreciate how he developed his set of beliefs," unquote. I agree. Knowing his medical background certainly helps us understand this man. It tells us a lot about his true deceptive character and presumably his large ego that motivated him to lie about his credentials to seem more impressive than he was. We also learn that he used a baby's death to shift blame off his own mediocrity and tear down women instead. And just by looking at this one aspect of his life, we already have learned that the reality of this man is much different than the rosy version that we've been taught. I've also already touched on how I don't agree with his views on the non-existence of souls in the spiritualism episode, and how he didn't independently rediscover anything in episode 2. In fact, I realized something pretty interesting while working on this episode. It turns out that I am not the first person to discover that John Thomas was not a real MD at that time. Back in 1886, someone with the initials EWK wrote that John Thomas was Mr. John Thomas Surgeon and not Dr. John Thomas. This person, a Christadelphian, I believe, also noticed that there was no record of Thomas having an MD, despite Thomas always crediting himself with having an MD for all those years. As I mentioned in a previous history episode, the biography Robert Roberts wrote is extremely bizarre, with major omissions about John Thomas's life, and as you keep reading, the fewer and fewer facts it contains about his life. So this person pointed out that the biography of John Thomas didn't say when or where he got his MD degree. And wouldn't you think that his biographer, who wrote the biography while John Thomas was alive, would have asked him that question and have an answer? It turns out Robert Roberts didn't know and had never even thought to ask. And so in 1886, which is now 15 years after John Thomas died in 1871, Robert Roberts finally tries to find out the answer to this question because someone is starting to ask questions. And what's incredible about this is that this means that someone else, a Christadelphian in the 1800s, also realized that something wasn't adding up here with his medical qualifications. And that means I am not the first to discover this, which would make me presumably about the second, maybe. It would perhaps be like I rediscovered it. I rediscovered Christadelphian truth. I can steal John Thomas's title as a rediscoverer of Christadelphian truth. I did it. I beat him at his own game. It's amazing. And so the Christadelphians should be thrilled, right? Don't they love people who rediscover truth? That's what they always say, right? You know, I am a woman, but nonetheless. But more predictably, I would expect that many of them would most likely respond with a defensive cognitive dissonance, like Robert Roberts did in his rebuttal to these accusations in the 1800s. Instead of acknowledging that John Thomas had spent most of his career publishing a lie about himself to seem more impressive than he was, Roberts published a very defensive and kind of salty article in the Christadelphian magazine. In the April 1886 edition, Roberts wrote that, quote, "It is a satisfaction, nevertheless, to know that the surmises and suspicions and allegations of former friends, whose course has caused amazement to the point of stupefaction, are without foundation," unquote. And, you know, I love the sass as a sass queen myself, but I mean, clearly your beliefs aren't without foundation, Robert Roberts, you know, as this episode is uncovering in detail, but let's keep going. Roberts then continues to write that it's very simple. Quote, "It was the case of an Englishman laying the foundation of his degree in England and emigrating to the States before its completion, and then finishing his professional qualification there, and in that country exercising the degree so obtained," unquote. And he hopes that, quote, "the publication of these documents may do something to silence the slanderous insinuations that have become current among the enemies of truth," unquote. And I mean, it sounds nice to say that this was just a simple misunderstanding, and if we just explain that he got his degree in America, then everything will be fine. But the facts don't support that conclusion. This is like the game of two truths and a lie. Part of that story is true, and part of it is absolutely not true. Because yes, John Thomas did his basic medical education in England. Yeah. But it's a bit of a stretch to then say, oh, he didn't complete it, because there's no evidence that he was ever working towards an MD in England. It's not like he left midway through a program or anything, although that definitely would have been his style. And then the part where Robert Roberts starts lying through his teeth is when he says that he finished his professional medical qualifications in America and then exercised his degree after that. Because nope, that is backwards. John Thomas got his MD at the end of his medical career. And as I said before, the dates are important. He claimed to have an MD for at least 15 years. Yes, while practicing medicine in America and claiming he had it then. So Roberts is ignoring those 15 years of lies by ignoring the dates and switching it around in a way that would make it sound better, but is not actually truthful. And yeah, if he got it in 1832, that would have been fine. But he didn't get it until 1848. That continues to be the problem. And in a way, I'm surprised that Robert Roberts couldn't acknowledge this, because dates are huge to Christadelphians. They're always sharing their next big prediction for what year the world will end. Roberts himself specifically did that multiple times, which we talked about in the prophecy episodes. So shouldn't dates be kind of important to Robert Roberts? Or are you just an expert at sweeping inconvenient dates under the rugs like all those failed prophecies throughout history? And Robert Roberts also revealed something pretty telling here as well. He wrote, quote, "It is immaterial what Dr. Thomas's standing was in the profession to which he belonged. He is in his grave, and his work is done, and the voice of the traducer can neither reach his ear nor interfere with the results of his 40 years of study and exposition of the scriptures of truth. Those results rest on a foundation that cannot be moved, even if it could be shown that Dr. Thomas was a charlatan," unquote. I mean, reading that last sentence, it kind of seems like he realizes John Thomas was absolutely a charlatan. And he just decided, I don't care. I don't care if he lied to us. My foundation will not be moved. I do not want to see the proof, even if it exists. Instead, he doubles down. He says, quote, "Dr. Thomas was above all things the enemy of fraud," unquote. I'd say they're besties, but okay. And he also says, quote, "The brethren are naturally indignant at the insult offered to the memory of a man whom even his enemies acknowledge to have been without match in the 19th century, and whom brethren have such special cause to hold in love and esteem," unquote. And more ironically, that he believes that, quote, "enmity cannot be silenced by evidence," unquote. And I do agree, because here's evidence, and you're not listening to it. You were not silent about it. Christadelphian S.M. Alger also wrote that, quote, "The doctor was resolutely addicted to telling the plain truth, welcome or unwelcome," unquote. And we've talked about cognitive dissonance. People will do what it takes to protect what they believe, even when faced with proof that those beliefs are not true. And so I think, someone that's not impacted by that would consider the impact of what this means to learn this, especially when it's someone who had so much influence over their life, to find out that they had been lying to you pretty much the whole time. Like I said, if you found out your spouse had been lying to you for 15 years, I wouldn't be surprised if you got a divorce. But it's like saying, I trust in everything we built together, even though, they lied about who they were to me the entire 15 years we were married. Most people would lose trust in that person or faith in that person that they could be good to them because of their behavior and the deception. And even the length of time that it occurred would probably be a factor. Something that happens once, probably a mistake. If it happens every day for 15 years, I would say that that is intentional. And that also means that other things may also be false. If that was me, it would call everything into question. But Roberts insists that his truth cannot be moved, and anyone who doesn't see things his way is an enemy, they're ignoring evidence, and they're insulting this good man's memory. Sure, if it makes you feel less uncomfortable with reality, Roberts, then you can believe that. But I would argue that the uncomfortable reality of the situation is enough to really damage the foundation of the Christadelphian religion. I mean, you claim that this religion is built on truth, and someone can identify with solid, documented, impartial evidence that it was actually built on decades of lies. Those two things are fundamentally not compatible. Either it's truth or it's not truth. And I have evidence that I'm sharing here publicly that it was not built on truth. When people stop caring about facts, like we see here as Robert Roberts essentially says he doesn't care if John Thomas was a charlatan, then that's when they seem to feel at liberty to erase the past and prop up this myth instead. I would argue that after Thomas's death, Robert Roberts begins turning John Thomas into this mythical person and a caricature while erasing who John Thomas really was. Roberts wants to bury the flaws that made John Thomas human and instead make Thomas seem like this Victorian-era prophet and holy man, even if there are many indicators that he was in actuality something of a con man. Those facts are not conducive to Robert's work organizing and preaching this new religion, though, so they had to be rewritten and obscured. And unfortunately, he and like-minded others were very effective. I did not know any of this when I was a Christadelphian and have only discovered most of this during my last year of intensively researching into this topic in order to discuss it here on this podcast. If I hadn't really put all of this effort into digging into it, I would have never known this either. And again, as we keep seeing, I can look at the same evidence as the Christadelphians and look at the same records, and I still reach a different conclusion. And I believe that is just because I am not attached to the outcome. I'm not a Christadelphian. And reading Robert Roberts' defense here shows that these writings by Christadelphians are often heavily biased, which then can cause them to kind of miss the point or to obscure key information. Because again, the dates were there. The MD degree was dated May 1848. But Roberts wrote an entire argument, this whole article, about how this is the proof and that this shows that they're wrong. And people probably just skimmed over the dates and totally missed this. And technically it was there, but the part that people read that they're presenting is untruthful. And again, I don't know whether it's intentional or not, if they were just kind of careless putting this together because they really wanted to make an argument. But unfortunately, the evidence they shared is flawed and shows the opposite of what they're claiming it shows. And now it's clear that I am the one rediscovering truth related to the Christadelphians, because these facts have somehow been hidden in plain sight for generations. And now I've found something that no one has apparently really been talking about since 1886. And you know what? Good. It's about time someone rediscovered this. All right, so let's move into our last myth of the day. So again, if you need a break, here's another good spot for it before we get into our last section. And this is going to include the reveal of that exciting biography that I was telling you about. We're also going to talk about cholera some more and butt stuff again, because don't forget that. And I can't take credit again for finding this resource, but this part's going to get pretty exciting because using this new biography that I found, I believe that my research has finally found the truth of why Dr. John Thomas left England for America in 1832. So we're going to bust our next myth wide open. The myth that old bad boy John Thomas left England for America to scope out the land for his dad and to leave that priest-ridden society. And once I got started with this myth, I was surprised to find that there are actually a lot more theories than I realized. And it sure seems like someone couldn't keep their story straight. So let's dive into our last myth for the first part of this episode. So let's review the original reasons that we learned for why he left for America. In episode 2, I shared that there were originally 2 versions of the story for why John Thomas left England. The first, that Hemingway records in John Thomas, His Friends and His Faith, is that John Thomas's father decided to send his son, Dr. John Thomas, ahead of him and his family. In this version, John Thomas presents himself as the responsible oldest son, protecting his family at the request of his father. This was obviously so noble of him. He was such a great son, so admirable. This is similar to the theory in Dr. Thomas, His Family, and the Background of His Times, which claims emigration fever and the deaths of some family members spurred the Thomas family to want to move to America. So family pressures and changes in the Thomas family would be the first reason we really hear about. But then there was the second version by Robert Roberts in Dr. Thomas, His Life and Work, where Roberts records that apparently Dr. Thomas told Roberts that he had insisted to his father that he go ahead of his family, and he also left because he was sick of the priest-ridden society in England. So in that version, John Thomas left for religious reasons, and he chose to leave without any prompting by his father. In this version, he's independent, strong in his religious beliefs, and a protector of his family. This is still similar to the first version, but with a more religious bent and perhaps smoothed over to be a little more inspiring for his followers to hear. Hemingway found a third version in the book The History of Medicine by Alexander Wilder, which was written in the early 1900s. In this version, quote, hopeless of any reform in medical procedures at home, he had come to America only to find matters worse. He would have returned except for his strong Republican proclivities, unquote. So in this version, John Thomas left due to his annoyance with the medical system in London, although he was also not a fan of America's medical system. This seems hard to believe considering he immediately took advantage of America's lax medical system. This was, however, the first time his political beliefs were mentioned, and as a major reason for his staying in America, which is interesting since Christadelphians are encouraged to be essentially apolitical, so we would assume that he was not active in politics in America. Okay, so these are the main reasons that Christadelphians have shared in their writings for why John Thomas left England. But we have finally reached the time when I'm going to share my secret resource that has been crucial in providing additional evidence to support various claims about John Thomas's background as a medical professional. And again, I don't think even Peter Hemingway knows about this, so you guys are really getting a scoop here. And I waited to really dig into this because it contains a fourth version of why John Thomas supposedly left England for America. And I'm generous with my sources, so I'll tell you all about it. I found this biography with the help of a librarian in the New England Botanic Medical and Surgical Journal written by Calvin Newton. And in the second volume of the journal and the 8th number, published in April 1848, Newton includes a biography of Dr. John Thomas. In this fourth version, written for other doctors to read, we get to hear the story from an entirely different perspective. Also, Peter Hemingway mentioned in his book that he didn't know where Alexander Wilder had sourced his material on John Thomas, and I suspect that this is the resource that Wilder was referencing for his book because you'll see some similarities here. And since Wilder was writing a book called The History of Medicine, it makes sense that he would quote a biography recorded in a medical journal. And it's just a reminder that resources on this podcast are all over the place. So Newton records of Dr. Thomas that, quote, taking more interest in party politics than they are entitled to in any country, and from his nature and education, loving liberty and truth where'er 'tis found, he has been invariably the advocate for what he believes. Not what other believes, but what he believes to be the truth in both science, politics, and religion. He has ever been the friend of reform and the mortal foe to hypocrisy and humbug. He perceived that there was no radical cure for the political maladies of Britain, and having been born into and brought up in the principles of the sect to which Oliver Cromwell belonged, the Independents, he determined to expatriate himself from his fatherland for what appeared to him the El Dorado of politics and religion in this Western Hemisphere. About this time, 1832, cholera made its appearance in London, and as many emigrant vessels had been attacked at sea and lost many of their people, the government issued an order that no such ship should leave port without a medical officer on board. Dr. Thomas was, consequently, appointed to the Marquis de Wellesley, unquote. Okay, so there's a lot to talk about here, but right off the bat, it's pretty crazy how different this version is from the previous versions. In this version of his biography, which was again published for other medical practitioners, it minimizes his religious reasons for leaving entirely, and instead we learn that John Thomas was like super de-duper political. And it gives us specifics because the author records that Thomas was raised to have a political affinity for the Independents. Christadelphians like Peter Hemingway have found it hard to believe that John Thomas was political. In the latest version of Hemingway's book, he wrote that, quote, the comments on the political activities of John Thomas are not elsewhere substantiated, unquote. But since he wrote that, I found the source that provides more specific details to help substantiate that claim. This claim is also, I believe, substantiated in that Christadelphian book, Dr. Thomas, His Family, and Background of His Times. Despite John Thomas's father being known for his religious views, he was also a very political man, as implied in this biography. Bloor wrote that John Thomas's father, the Reverend John Thomas, spoke of, quote, the most sacred rights of British freedom and the blood-bought Protestant liberty. This is, of course, a politico-religious standpoint, and it is noticeable that there is not a single scriptural quotation in the whole pamphlet, unquote. So John Thomas was raised by a very political father who seems to have prioritized politics over religion in this writing, at least. So I think these resources do lend some support to this claim that Christadelphians don't like or don't want to believe. Also, do you remember how our boy John Thomas wrote to the Lancet in support of the Anatomy Bill legislation? That also seems pretty political too. So I'd consider that claim at least somewhat substantiated, since I've already got 3 arguments there. Personally, I don't know a lot about the history of politics in England in the 1800s, so I didn't really know what it meant when he said Thomas had an affinity for the independents. So according to Wikipedia, the independents in the 1600s to 1800s wanted freedom of religion and for the government to not really have a role in religion, it sounded like. This group included Puritans who wanted to purify or reform the Church of England, and the article said that many nonconformists later migrated to the North American colonies. Okay, sounds good so far. But they were also apparently pretty aggressive and were responsible for something called Pride's Purge, which led to the execution of Charles I, which temporarily ended the monarchy in England. And after King Charles was executed, Oliver Cromwell, apparently Dr. Thomas's hero mentioned in the source, became ruler of England until his death in 1658. However, not long after his death, King Charles II came to power and reestablished the monarchy. And to go full circle, Charles Jr. here decided to avenge his dad, Charles Sr., by disinterring Cromwell's body, beheading the corpse, and displaying it on the roof of Westminster Hall until 1684. Wild. So that's just a short tangent to get a picture in your mind of where John Thomas fit in politically in Britain. He would have been someone who wanted freedom of religion, was not a fan of the monarchy, and would have wanted less control by the government on his religious beliefs as well. But to get back to discussing the various reasons that are recorded for why he immigrated, I love the irony of his political motivation to immigrate. I find it so interesting that someone who, according to his biography, emigrated for political reasons, later founded a sect whose members he will not allow to vote in politics. Because, this guy definitely voted in England, right? This source strongly indicates that he was not apolitical during his life. Also, I don't know how someone could describe America in the 1800s as El Dorado, the mythical golden city of riches in South America, in any way. In 1830s America, the white people were actively committing genocide against the native people. They passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which directly led to the Trail of Tears, where Native Americans were put into detention camps where many were dying of sickness, and then the survivors were marched out west to be relocated, and it was just brutal. And basically, if you slowed down during that forced march, you were killed. So an estimated 12 to 17,000 people died during that walk. Slavery was only abolished in New York at that time, so it was generally legal throughout the United States. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in America, and they were being forcibly converted to Christianity. The Native American culture was being obliterated. The political climate was heating up with the Civil War on the horizon. So, to me, that doesn't sound like the El Dorado of politics and religion. But I guess if you're a rich, white Christian guy, and if you fit into one of the political parties, sure. The other thing I wanted to look at from this 4th version, I wanted to compare with the originals, is that John Thomas's father was completely left out of this story. Did you notice that he was missing? Did John Thomas just make that up to try to make himself sound like a good son? Or did he want to write out his father because he had a big ego and dad was stealing some of his spotlight? Because while the role of his father changed, his father had been one of the few consistent parts of this narrative so far. And suddenly he's just gone in this version. And while it seems so random to have his dad be part of the story, It seems likely that his dad did have some role in his emigration because his father left for America shortly after John Thomas did, and his family actually arrived just 3 days after him as well. So they were traveling in very close proximity to each other. So according to this version of events, John Thomas decided completely independently without any prompting by his father to go to America. Although now the government is involved because they were desperate for doctors to travel on ships to America because of cholera. And at first I thought it sounded like they assigned him to the ship somehow, like it was a draft. But then I read this line in Bloor's book, Dr. Thomas, His Family and the Background of His Times. Quote, "At this point, we pause to consider what a remarkable thing it was that Dr. Thomas chose medicine as a career, for it enabled him to make journeys across the Atlantic as ship surgeon at no cost." Unquote. So, that's what it probably was. I think it was just that every ship needed a doctor now, so he could travel for free because doctors were in high demand and there was an incentive for them to go on these ships. So, although it makes me more confused about how he served as a chaplain on the ship, because he was supposed to just go as a doctor. Like, they needed doctors, not chaplains. So how did that even come up? I even Googled around a little just to check that it wasn't common practice for a doctor to also be the ship chaplain. In fact, if there wasn't one, then it usually fell to the captain to lead the religious services. So it seems likely that John Thomas had some sort of religious affiliation or qualification to have ended up with that role at all at the time. And I don't think we'll know for sure, but seeing as he also had published some religious opinions in the Lancet prior to leaving for England, I think we can all just agree that he was more religious during that time than Christadelphians will admit. So getting back to this resource, this emphasis on his role as the ship's doctor and on disease at the time also makes it feel like there was a huge omission in the previous versions, because Robert Roberts makes zero mention of cholera or of Dr. Thomas really performing any duties as a doctor on board the ship in Thomas's biography. So it's so strange because it sounds like him traveling as a doctor was a huge part of this story, especially when told from this medical perspective. If there hadn't been an outbreak of cholera, he may not have been needed, it sounds like. And rather than performing religious services, as was recorded in his biography, I would have expected stories related to the condition of other passengers and of him fulfilling his medical duties on board. But instead, in Christadelphian histories, we hear like these religious stories that are published for a religious audience. And it almost makes me wonder if the stories that he recorded about the voyage were even real, because he just can't keep his story straight, even about what role he had on the ship. Also, while we're talking about him being a doctor on the ship, the other Christadelphian biographies also left out that 2 people died on that voyage under his care. In the New England Botanic Medical and Surgical Journal, it gives us details from his trip from, again, a medical point of view. So it records that apparently one of the crew fell off the main top yard, which I don't know if you can fix that. And the other passenger was just listed as someone who just died. And unfortunately, the article didn't say how. Like, maybe it was a murder and it was like a locked door mystery where like someone on the boat did it and no one knows who it was. Or maybe it was just childbirth without antiseptics and a man who won't wash his hands in the 1800s. Who knows? And there is a 5th version of events for why he left America, which is why I'm going through all of them together and just comparing them all. And this last version of events does relate to his medical qualifications. And it's pretty juicy. But we're going to just chat about cholera real quick first, while we're still talking about this 4th explanation for why John Thomas left England for America. Because remember, I did say we were going to talk about butts again. So John Thomas was leaving for America right as the first ever cholera epidemic was breaking out in London. Cholera first appeared in that region the year before in 1831, so this was a brand new disease to everyone in that area, and it's bacteria that spreads through food and water contaminated with feces. So if you wonder why people want to regulate and not have sewage in our water and not have sewage spread on agricultural fields, cholera is a big reason why. And cholera was incredibly deadly at that time. They estimate that 52,000 people died in Britain in 1832 alone from cholera. And it still exists in the modern day. In places with poor sanitation, cholera can still infect between 1 and 4 million people and cause between 21,000 and 143,000 deaths worldwide every year. So John Thomas was in the medical profession when this new disease came on the scene, and because he is so smart and he knows everything about everything, he wrote an article that was published in The Lancet that year, and just 2 months before he left for America, entitled Synopsis of the Treatment of the Malignant Cholera. Thomas wrote, quote, "I confess my experience in this disease is as nothing," unquote, which is a great start to an article offering advice to medical professionals. But on the other hand, I can't really hold it against him, considering the lack of medical knowledge at that time among all of the English medical professionals, since they hadn't had cholera in that region of the world before. And it does seem to me to indicate that he probably had a big ego as a surgeon to want to publicly publish his treatments for this. But you know what? It's relevant to our conversation today because they needed these doctors to treat cholera. So let's see how he would have treated people for this. Despite his lack of experience, he did have some suggestions for the treatment of cholera, which includes, I shit you not, and I use the word shit very intentionally here because we're about to talk about butts again. Quote, "By the successive injection of fluids into the rectum at about 98 degrees Fahrenheit, such as veal broth, laudanum, or catchu, or other astringent," unquote. And then, quote, "plugging up the anus by a tapering cork, smooth and oiled, and secured with a bandage," unquote. Yes, veal broth enemas and butt plugs. For those who, like me, didn't know what all those fluids were, laudanum is opium dissolved in alcohol. And yeah, it's funny to look back at medicine and history and realize that doctors were peddling real drugs, not just anti-inflammatories. Here, have some opium for your troubles, kids. And the other one, catchu, is an extract of a tropical acacia tree, and it sounds like that was recognized herbal medicine, so I guess that's why know-it-all white guy put it at the bottom of his list. Don't give me any of that stuff. Also, just as an aside, do you think John Thomas would be peddling bone broth and coffee enemas now? Because, in the 1800s, he already thought veal broth enemas could treat cholera. I personally think he would have loved those trends. Okay. And also, you're welcome for the image of Dr. Thomas oiling up cork butt plugs. I bet you didn't see that coming in this episode. And I mean, as we said before, probably wasn't gay. But if you were looking for something, it does sound like he did put butt plugs in men's butts. So that's just a fun fact to take with you today. Okay, so what's next in Surgeon Thomas's cholera cure? After the veal broth enema, John Thomas recommended that the patient drink hot brandy and then should be told to be tranquil and cheerful because gaslighting sick patients and telling women to just smile has apparently been the secret to healthy patients for generations. When cholera reached the second stage after this initial stage of treatment, John Thomas recommended drinking brandy with opium and continuing the veal broth enemas. Because if it didn't work the first time, maybe it'll work the second time around if you're drunk. By the third stage, he recommended calomel, which will come up again in this medical conversation later on. And fun fact, calomel is considered toxic and is rarely used nowadays since it has the potential for mercury poisoning. It can also soften the gums and cause people's teeth to fall out. So yes, the final step to curing your patient is giving them mercury because nothing says health and healing like mercury poisoning. And while I was researching mercury, I also stumbled onto the American Heritage website, which provided some more information about just the state of medicine in America at that time. And one example on the website was 2 doctors had a duel to the death over who was going to be the town's doctor and see patients there. Yeah, that was the El Dorado of politics and religion. In America, your doctor might be the one who murdered all the other doctors in town. But don't worry, it's only a 50-50 chance that he'll kill you too. Now, let's take a break for a word from our sponsor. Calomel, calomel, calomel will make you well. Calomel, the 1800s wonder drug. Calomel can cure every illness known to man through a few drops of concentrated mercurial power. We have countless rousing testimonials, like one from a man who calls himself Dr. John Thomas. He said he had 2 occasions to use it while acting as a ship's doctor to America, and the patients seemed to be recovering afterwards. Let's not worry about their final status by the end of that voyage, but I'm sure they made a full recovery. With only minimal side effects, calomel should be in every doctor's medical home visit bag. After all, with calomel will make you well, and you can't be sick if you're dead. Side effects include loss of all teeth, tremors, personality changes, deformities, cramping, or death. Talk to your 1800s surgeon or surgeon pretending to be a medical doctor about calomel today. Thank you to our sponsor, and let's get back to the podcast. Okay, so that was the 4th, and I believe previously undiscovered version of why John Thomas traveled to America, because of cholera and politics and medicine. And now that we've heard this new explanation for why Dr. Thomas left England, I have bad news for you, because now we're up to the 5th and final version for why John Thomas says that he left England for America. And to my surprise, this 5th version comes straight from Christadelphian sources again, and this is one of the places where Dr. Craig Fairweather changed the trajectory of my research, because he has been doing research of Christadelphian history and writings way longer than me, so he was the one who knew about this resource and sent it over to me to reference for this episode. I'm not sure I would have found it myself, and my episodes are only as good as the source material I'm able to find for them, so again, I appreciate the help. Okay. So this 5th version was actually found in an article written in the Tidings magazine back in 2005. Hard to believe, but 20 years ago now. This article was written by my favorite Christadelphian name to pronounce like a pirate, Alan Arr. It all started when Alan, no, I'm just gonna not say his last name again, was in London, and he was speaking to a local Christadelphian brother who told him that he had heard that John Thomas had practiced medicine illegally in London. Alan decided to investigate that claim himself and publish his findings in the Tidings, which honestly good for them for publishing it, because it isn't something that I would think they would really want to hear or disseminate. Regardless, in the article, Alan records that he was able to confirm that Dr. Thomas was in fact illegally practicing medicine in London. Yeah, it's kind of like finding out Santa isn't real. Like, as a kid, I grew up hearing Dr. Thomas's name spoken reverently as people quoted him at the platform and read his books. And I watched as people were baptized and pledged to spend the rest of their lives upholding this belief system he created. And then, as an adult, I just keep uncovering crimes he committed. So, what were the details for this? In the article, Alan wrote, quote, John Thomas was indeed qualified academically, but he was either unable to afford or refused to pay the exorbitant fee of US $102,000 at 2005 value, which was required to practice legally in London. So according to the financial records, he paid a much lower fee, which only entitled him to practice in certain areas of Britain outside London. But the records in Hackney show that he decided to break the law and practice illegally in London. Note, this was several years before his coming to the truth, unquote. Like, oh my God, I told you John Thomas was a bad boy. And yes, I do love the disclaimer at the end, because a good Christadelphian serves bad news for their faith with a side of cognitive dissonance. Our founder, who was guided by God to found our religion, was a criminal with a shady past, but, John Thomas didn't know all our doctrines yet, so it's okay for him to be a grown adult operating an illegal medical practice and breaking the law. He hadn't founded our religion yet, so let's just assume he stopped being a criminal later when he had more power and money, because those things never cause corruption or anything like that. And no wonder they didn't really care much about that organ trafficking, because And again, the cognitive dissonance at the end to minimize this and choose to ignore facts like these that are counter to their beliefs just illustrate how turned off critical thinking is within the group. And it highlights the blind devotion to this belief system which is another red flag for a group being a cult. And Allen's disclaimer also provides an interesting explanation, because using that logic, Christadelphians shouldn't break the law after they're baptized and know the quote truth, but it's fair game to have a life of crime prior to joining. So I guess Christadelphians won't hesitate to fellowship with ex-convicts then? Like, that's what I'm getting from this article. Commit all the crime you want before you're baptized, just not after. Except maybe after too, if you have enough influence and social currency. Got it. And now I wonder, like, what else would Christadelphians overlook in order to keep supporting John Thomas? Like, what if we found out that John Thomas did, like, murder that passenger on the ship, and someone would be like, well, it was before he was baptized, so it's okay. Like, he probably just needed the body for dissection. You gotta make money somehow. Like, what crime wouldn't they look the other way for? Body snatching is fine. Lying about having an MD while working as a doctor, impersonating a doctor is fine. Operating an illegal medical practice, that's fine. Honestly, who knows what other crimes I'll uncover on this podcast at this point? Because the more I learn about him, the shadier a person he turns out to be. And there are ecclesias kicking people out for believing in evolution, for being a little gay, for just not attending their memorial services enough, not coming every Sunday. Meanwhile, this guy got away with so much worse and is being praised. We're reading his books like he's a prophet. Even when his prophecies are wrong, just edit it out and keep publishing them. Like, are you kidding me? And putting aside this argument that he didn't have to be a good person yet because he wasn't a Christadelphian, this still seems like pretty clear evidence that he was not, strictly speaking, an honest person. He knowingly broke the law in England. And this is why I wanted to wait to discuss what John Thomas was doing before he left for America after his graduation, because I think it really gives us a better picture of what led up to him leaving and reinforces the type of person we are rediscovering him to be. And it's interesting to see how the various sources diverge here. And I think they differ mainly because of his lies. Like Hemingway, who I presume is a good Christadelphian, repeated the false information, which by this point is disappointing, but not surprising, since many of the myths we discussed today were just parroted from old Christadelphian documents. In Hemingway's book, he wrote that at the time that Thomas was leaving for America, quote, in May 1832, Dr. Thomas was a fully certified medical practitioner, having qualified as a surgeon, and he left behind his own successful 3-year private practice at Hackney, London, unquote. Okay, so he practiced medicine in Hackney then, right? I mean, this may be subtle, but Hemingway may have been throwing off his readers here as well. From looking online, it appears that Hackney originally was a rural village outside of London, and it did not become the modern-day borough of London until the 1900s. Since John Thomas was living in the 1800s, the village of Hackney would have been a distinct place outside of London. For a modern reader, you won't think much of someone describing Hackney as being London, but we're discussing history here. So at the time that we are talking about, that was not the case, and Hackney was not technically part of London. So this again means that the information presented in Hemingway's book is kind of untrue and thereby misleading again. And to be fair, John Thomas started it by lying first. And in the Lancet, he always noted that he was in Hackney when he was authoring those articles. So maybe Hemingway just accepted what Thomas said at face value. Oh, he was working in Hackney. But John Thomas also specifically wrote that he was in Hackney, not Hackney, London. He never added that part. So the addition of London appears to be all Hemingway. And since that part was not recorded by Thomas, and it was supposed to be kind of a secret that he was actually working in London, I'm not sure where that came from. If Hemingway knew and kind of wanted to cover his bases or make it harder to identify, just kind of say, oh, well, they're basically the same. Like, I don't know what the thinking was there. But now we also have a resource that wasn't written by a Christadelphian or written at a time when John Thomas was still worried about being caught for a crime in England anymore. In the biography that I discovered in that medical journal published in 1848, It interestingly doesn't have any mention of a medical practice in Hackney. Instead, it records, quote, having passed his examinations, he commenced practice in the vicinity of London and officiated as surgeon, etc., to a dispensary in the neighborhood, unquote. So this quote is referring to those same few years after his graduation before he left for America. But instead of Hackney, the article mentions Thomas working in London, as Allen also discovered and corroborated. So it does appear that there was plenty of evidence that John Thomas was practicing medicine in London while claiming to be practicing in Hackney because he wanted to pay the lower fees. And this brings us to what I believe is the real reason that John Thomas emigrated to America. Allen admitted as much and describes his reasons for why he thought he relocated when he wrote in his article that, quote, in frustration, his illegal status led him to emigrate, unquote. And Allen did write that in the nicest way he could for his Christadelphian audience. Like, oh, John Thomas was just frustrated. You know, like when men murder women because they just had a bad day. Like, why should men face any accountability for their feelings? Because, I mean, I would probably phrase it more like, in order to avoid prison and having to pay related fines, John Thomas fled to America. And if this is the case, then it makes more sense why he left so suddenly and even traveled alone before his family. Maybe his family was helping pack up his stuff while he made a run for it, and they're like, yeah, we'll bring it to you. Who knows? And John Thomas was not a very nice guy. So if someone had discovered his crime and had been burned by him, I wouldn't be surprised if they tipped someone off to get back at him. Like, I can't prove that, but like maybe that mom of that dead baby got her revenge is all I'm saying. And the seriousness of this allegation is why I think this explanation may be the real reason why John Thomas immigrated to America. If you had to pick the strongest motivator between being a good son, leaving a priest-ridden society, volunteering to treat cholera on a ship to support your government, leaving out of frustration with a lack of political and medical reform, or avoiding prison time, which one sticks out to you as the strongest motivator to leave your country and not come back for decades? I would guess prison time. So returning back to our story, if John Thomas was only qualified to legally practice medicine in Hackney, which at the time would have been a rural village and not yet part of London, why did he choose to illegally practice in London instead? Through my research on medical practices in this era, I found that John Thomas mentioned that doctors were paid more in cities, so it's possible that he was looking to lower his costs by lowering his licensing fees, while also increasing his revenue by working in a more expensive area. Based on that, it appears that he could have been trying to get rich and using illegal methods to do so, hoping he wouldn't get caught. And again, Hemingway would disagree with me, since he wrote in his book, quote, Dr. Thomas did not seek the riches of this world, unquote. But we're going to have to agree to disagree on that one, because we just saw our first example of John Thomas committing a crime in order to earn more money, which certainly seems like seeking riches. So I think there's evidence to believe that John Thomas moved to America to escape going to prison in England. And if that's the case, then the founder of the Christadelphians, whose heroic story usually begins with him sailing to America to rediscover the truth, was possibly a fugitive at that time, which is as ironic as everything else in this episode. A man called Doctor who is not a doctor. A man not seeking riches who has to flee his country of origin because he was seeking riches. A man who hates women but wrote classes on their health anyways. Clearly a man who we should follow at all times to lead us into the afterlife. I'm sure the chronic lying has no relation to the church he founded or anything. Also, he must have been so relieved when the other passenger in cabin class with him was arrested when that ship docked in America and not him. Like, I didn't even know about this stuff at the time, about him having an illegal practice, when I shared episode 2. And now I'm so glad I included that tidbit, because it's so funny that there was 2 alleged felons leading those church services on the boat on the way to America. Like, that's just kind of hilarious. And again, people say history is boring, but I don't think they've studied it, because it's actually just crazy. Like, I had to debate putting John Thomas in the true crime episode again. Like, you know it's bad when the founder of the religion you grew up in is one of the most infamous characters in your group. And Alan just really doesn't want us to think about all that technical stuff. Let's just turn off the critical thinking. Let's not worry about criminal activity. After all, John Thomas is still the hero of this story when told by Christadelphians. So we should actually feel bad for John Thomas. Alan wrote that the licensing system was, quote, elitist and deliberately designed to keep the medical profession firmly within the male upper class of society and to effectively prevent upward social mobility through medical education. In frustration, his illegal status led him to emigrate, unquote. See, he was just a frustrated guy who hated elitism. If you're frustrated, also, apparently crimes are no longer illegal. Right, Alan? Thanks for clarifying that. And beyond the nonsense of that viewpoint, the quote I just read from Alan is again pretty ironic because I believe John Thomas was a white elitist man, or at least wanted to be elite. Alan's defense of Dr. Thomas's criminal past seems to have been to argue that John Thomas was against the things that only benefit the male upper class society. So instead of us criticizing him, we should instead criticize the social structures that gave men and the wealthy privilege. Thomas's behavior was justified because he was fighting against this problem of elitism. But this seems like another place where the surface level explanation Christadelphians give to explain away poor behavior, it sounds nice, but in reality, it's not based on real evidence looking at who John Thomas was. He was not against male upper class privilege in the slightest. Remember the book about the midwives and their social status? Thomas was writing in support of women being pushed out of that previously female-dominated profession. And as we learn, this was likely because surgeons like him were using it as stepping stones for their medical careers. They were firmly protecting that hierarchy of having men at the top as an elite group. If he had been against this, like Alan is trying to say, then he should have been supporting women and supporting Sir Anthony Carlisle in his advocacy for women. But he didn't. So this argument does not hold up. We've already found evidence that John Thomas was stepping on women to get where he wanted. So let's not pretend that he was this social justice warrior who wanted equality. He also set up a male upper class in the ecclesias, which has persisted to this day. So this argument may sound nice, but it's absolutely not grounded in reality. It's just more cognitive dissonance as he tries to find a way to package this that doesn't cast any criticism onto Thomas. That way he can continue to be the hero figure that Christadelphians want him to be. Okay, so that brings us to the last recorded explanation that I have found for why John Thomas emigrated to America and was clearly fleeing because he ran an illegal medical practice in England. And that ties into our episode theme today of investigating his medical qualifications. And this section perhaps shows more red flags about him, even just considering how many different versions exist recording his motivations to move to America. Like just the fact that there are so many different stories floating around about the same event, and they're all supposedly attributed to him directly, should raise red flags for me about his integrity and honesty, because it's indicating that he cannot tell the truth and keep his story straight. It seems like he was always reading his audience and changing his story to fit the situation. It was never about the truth of the facts of his life, so much as it was about projecting a version of himself to others that selfishly helped him get what he wanted or hid his actual selfish actions that he didn't want other people to know about. It's incredible that just by diving in deeper into this one aspect of John Thomas's life, we've already uncovered some pretty damning information about who he was and how he moved through the world. Fortunately, I went into this not believing that he was sent by God or anything. So this is interesting, but it doesn't change my beliefs at all because I wasn't invested. But I know we have a mixed audience here of people who have left, are leaving, a few who never joined, and those who are members and want to stay while still being informed about their religion's history. So definitely take some time to process this if you need to, and visit the podcast social media on Facebook or Instagram if you want to see some of the resources I mentioned here in this episode. I hope that people are actually interested in the truth as it can be discovered through facts, because if people choose to believe a liar after his lies are exposed, then it doesn't make much sense to me to have people claim that they're interested in truth. Okay, so I think that brings us to a good place to wrap up for today. We covered a lot, starting with his medical education and apprenticeships in England, looked into what Thomas was teaching after he graduated. We uncovered the absolutely massive lie that he spent at least 15 years publishing that he had a medical degree that he did not have. And we also uncovered that he probably left for America not because he was a divine instrument of God, but because he was probably fleeing London as a fugitive for not paying the required medical fees for his practice. And as a bonus, you got to read his most sexist article that was actually somehow published and learn about his antiquated medical treatments, which include pouring warm broth in people's butts and then plugging them up with corks. So sorry if you're traumatized, but if I have to know this stuff, then I guess you have to know it now too. So in the second part of this episode, I plan to look into the rest of his life as a medical professional in the United States, discuss the circumstances in which he got his MD degree almost 2 decades after saying he already had one, and speculate about his motivations for all these lies and pursuits using the historical references I've been able to find. And we'll reflect on what we've learned about this man so far. So thank you to all of our listeners who also patiently waited for our 3rd season. Having these breaks gives me the time to work on the research and preparations for these history episodes, so I do appreciate your support when I take breaks from releasing episodes in between seasons. And that's all for today, so I hope you stay tuned for the second half of this episode to finally learn more of the truth about John Thomas and the history of the Christadelphians. Bye, everyone. Thank you to everyone who has helped make this episode of the podcast possible. Today's episode was edited by me, Zinnia. I'd also like to thank Al Kroons for creating our intro music and the ex-Christadelphians that submitted audio for the intro music. If you'd like to join our community, you can find us at the group for ex-Christadelphians on Facebook. You can also follow our social media on Facebook and Instagram at Life After Leaving Podcast. If you'd like to come on the podcast, reach out to me at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review or sharing this podcast with a friend. That's all for today. Thanks and see you next time.